Hello everyone, this is What If Fanfic and today I'll bring you What If Naruto was sent to Games of Thrones Final. The link to the story will be in the description. If you want to hear a fanfiction, please comment down below. Now on to the story.
Reappearing in Winterfell in Bran's room was quite amusing for Naruto. If seeing Ned hunch over and almost throw up from the way they had traveled was pretty funny, then seeing Caitlyn shriek and jump nearly 5 feet in the air was hilarious. But then the blonde caught a look of Bran, who was lying on the bed and hadn't even twitched at their sudden arrival. One last clone looked up from where he'd been sitting and dispelled, giving Naruto the memories of the situation. Walking over, he smiled down at the second youngest Stark boy. "Hey, kid, how ya doin'?" Bran almost didn't bother looking at him. "My legs hurt." "That's to be expected," Naruto said, grinning widely. "That's just the nerves below your waist telling the rest of your body that they're cranky. You'll be climbing like a lunatic again in no time." That was finally enough for the boy to crack a smile, but Kat interjected almost immediately. "My son will not be climbing again, and that is final." Naruto's eye flicked over to her almost lazily, and he raised an eyebrow. "I would hope that what Bran does with his time is up to him, wouldn't you?" Coloring in anger at his flippant remark, Caitlyn was about to lay into him before Ned stepped in to head off any argument. "That's enough. Right now I just want to spend time with my son, you two can argue later." Seeing the red-haired woman look away in a huff, Naruto snorted in amusement. "Yeah, sure, I'll step outside for a minute. Find a clone when you're done, and he'll take you back to the procession." Turning to the youngest in the room, the blonde grinned down at him. "Glad to see you awake, kiddo. I'll talk to you later." A small smile was response enough for him, so he turned and walked outside, leaving the family to enjoy catching up. Leaning against the wall outside, Naruto sighed a little and looked around at the hallway he found himself in. It was almost a month since he'd seen this place in person. Seeing it through the eyes, or eye, rather, of a clone just wasn't quite the same. He glanced over at a pale scratch that stood out against the dark stone of the wall. No one but him knew exactly what had made it, as he'd told Ned that he was playing with his knives one night and fumbled with one. Naruto could tell that the man didn't quite believe him, but figured that even he could mess up sometimes. The smile slowly slid from his face as he laid a hand against the wall and remembered his blood clone's memories of what had actually happened. Flashback. It was a few weeks after they had left. The castle was almost empty, several dozen household guards having gone with the Lord of Winterfell. A strange man walked through the corridors, feeling like his heart was about to burst out of his chest. The number of the freakish copies seemed to be dwindling, and the young brat of a lord had finally convinced his mother to leave his brother's room. There would be no better time than this. He crept along as quickly as he could without alerting anyone who would be there. The hallway was spacious and well lit by dozens of torches, not his preferred place to be on any given day, least of all now. Merely a few steps away from the door, and he could barely move. He knew the tales of the beast that lived within these walls, and the consequences of his action tonight would ignite its fury like nothing else. But with some luck, a massive amount of luck, he might be able to slip away before anyone noticed. Greed warred with fear in his mind. The amount he was being paid was indeed substantial, but the risk he was taking was equally massive. "Hey there," someone said into his ear. Barely stopping a startled yelp, he swung around, the dagger in his hand hitting nothing but air until the end of his swing, whereupon it bit into the rock, leaving a long, pale scratch. There was no one there. Holding the trembling blade in front of him, he scanned the hallway, seeing nothing. There was no cover to be seen, no shadow big enough to hide in. Then, from right behind him came another whisper. Hoping to start some trouble, the assassin spun around again, swinging wildly. "Come out and face me like a man," he shouted. Naruto raised an eyebrow from where he was sticking from his hands and feet to the ceiling, wondering how long he could mess with the guy before he finally looked up. Silently skittering back around, he leaned his head down. "Why should I?" Quickly pulling back up, he watched the man spin around again, swinging the knife like a lunatic at empty air as he tried to find someone that wasn't there. He slowly stepped back, rallying what little courage he had left. Finally, with a voice that was half hysterical, he gave up and yelled into the corridor. "Where are you?" Naruto grinned darkly and leaned down right behind him, not moving an inch this time. "Here." The man turned around and saw him hanging upside down from the ceiling, letting out a terrified shout. He wasn't fast enough to get away, as a punch from Naruto broke his nose and flung him almost 6 meters, down to the end of the hall. Just as well the ninja had taken the precaution of sealing this part of the castle against sound, else they might have drawn some attention by now. The man managed to sit up and groped around his face for a while, tears in his eyes as blood streamed from his nose. Then he slowly looked up, and was suddenly incapable of breathing. Like a monster straight out of his worst nightmares, the demon of the north skittered slowly across the ceiling, his clawed hands digging into the stone, his one dark eye narrowed to a slit. A mad grin adorned his face, far too wide to be natural, shining teeth lengthened to fangs. Every torch that he passed was snuffed out, bringing the darkness closer and closer. The man shuffled backwards, tears of sheer terror running down his face as he tried to escape. But then, his back hit the wall, and the last torches were extinguished. The moon in the window over his head gave just enough light for him to see the demon drop from the ceiling, landing on his hands and toes without a sound. Then he slowly stood up, the feral grin on his face never left, and the assassin knew in that moment that he was looking at pure evil. Naruto slowly raised a hand, wagging his finger. Quote, "Shouldn't have come here." The man knew that there was only one way to avoid the pain that was coming. The ninja could outfight him and outsmart him. There was no amount of money that could save him, no bargain that could be made for his life. So without hesitation, he took hold of the dagger still within his hand and stabbed it up into his brain. And the last thing the failed assassin felt was relief. Naruto, on the other hand, was shocked, his eye going wide as he saw the man casually commit suicide. Wow, that escalated quickly. Scratching his head and blushing in embarrassment, he looked around to see if anyone was there. He hadn't meant to scare him that much. Even still, he thought, returning to being serious, the only regret he felt at that moment was that he hadn't found out who had sent him. All those with power or money enough to try wouldn't have dared. Tywin and Baelish were wary enough to be more subtle in their attempts. Pycelle was a pussy, and Varys didn't have the inclination. And they all knew him well enough by now to know that one only targeted those close to him if they were hoping for complete and utter annihilation. That left a few kingdoms worth of suspects, but most of them feared him too much to try anything. So it would have been someone he didn't know personally, with lots of money, few morals and fewer brain cells. Not exactly a narrow list. Reaching down, he removed the rather unique dagger, thoroughly wiping the blood on the man's clothes. Summoning a few clones to dispose of the body, he tapped the tip of the handle on his chin. No need to tell the Starks until he had something to report. Kat was being protective enough as it was, and if he told her what had happened, he'd never hear the end of it. Flashback end. He'd been looking around for the guilty party for quite a while. His legion of transformed clones spread throughout every city in the kingdoms were working on this and a dozen other problems, and were getting closer. But he was tired from the events of the day, and decided to put it off for now. He faded from Winterfell without a sound, the torches snuffing out at his exit. XXXXXXX. Reappearing in his city, he stared up at the main building in the center where Elia and Ashara were staying. It was 3 stories tall and very expansive, with everything from a hot spring pool to a shaded garden. They'd taken the largest room with the softest, fluffiest bed, which the 2 ladies had affectionately dubbed the snuggling fox, which he protested to no avail. Naruto walked through the door, making his way upstairs to where he could feel 2 familiar presences. As he walked into the dimly lit room, his exhaustion slowly draining away as he caught sight of the 2 women he cared so much about. Both were sitting on the bed with their eyes closed, their quiet breathing the only sound in the room. Elia and Ashara were both fast asleep, breathing softly as they leaned into each other, the former princess's head on her friend's shoulder. Just seeing them there was enough to quell whatever anger he'd been feeling over the long, emotional day. Sitting gently on the edge of the bed so as not to wake them, he smiled softly. Quote, "How the hell did I get so lucky?" And he really was. It was amazing to think of the way the 2 of them had changed from when they had first met to this very moment. Before he could think any more, he was suddenly seized by a raging headache as memories not his own surged through his mind. Well, he thought ruefully. Not entirely my own, at least. A clone had just dispelled, one that had been around for quite a long time now, at least a month. As for where it had dispelled from. Naruto sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose, reaching forward, he gently stroked Elia's cheek, watching as her eyes screwed shut, before finally fluttering open. Naruto, what's? I need to go to Dorne for a little while, he said quietly, and watched as her eyes widened in recognition. Does she need me too? No, Elia, he whispered quietly, leaning forward and stealing a quick kiss, tasting hints of vanilla and mint on her lips. Stay, sleep, I'll tell you everything once I'm back. She smiled and sat up to kiss him in return. Quote, "Don't be gone long, you still have a lot to do. Don't have to tell me," he said, running a hand through his shaggy hair, before he slowly faded away. See ya soon, XXXXXXX. He reappeared over 2,000 miles away and nearly caused the man he'd teleported to leap out of his skin. Shuddering sand hills, boy, how do you always do that? Nice to see you too, Grouchy. Doran Martell glared at the young boy that had just popped up by his elbow in an orange-colored flash, and waved off a few guards that had pulled out their swords. He'd rather not have the patio of the water garden stained with blood, especially so early in the morning. Where is she? Doran stilled, and motioned to a side passage. That way. Naruto nodded and walked in the direction that had been pointed to without another word. Seemed that the Prince of Dorne was still upset with him, for reasons he could easily guess. But there would be time enough for that later. He stopped short outside of one intricately carved door, that he knew would be locked, and so knocked once, paused, and then knocked twice more. A soft voice carried from inside the room. Naruto, is that you? Yep. A short pause, and then the sound of several bolts being turned, and the door opened. A beautiful young woman stood in front of him, dark hair a mess, wearing a thin gown to cover her modesty. A young woman he recognized. Morning, Ariane, have a good sleep. The young princess of Dorne glared at him, her dark eyes, so similar to her aunt's, glittering in the firelight. Shut up and get in here. He did so promptly, and his gaze fell on the second person in the room. Rhaenys Martell, for she had adamantly refused to use her father's name, sat huddled on the cool tiles with her knees drawn up, staring into the fireplace. He walked over and sat down next to her, enjoying the heat. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't always hot in the desert, especially at night. But even though he could feel Rhaenys shivering, he knew it wasn't because of the cold. Ariane quietly sat on her cousin's other side, leaning into her shoulder. They all sat there for a while, not speaking. Then Rhaenys shifted slightly. Bah. What the hell are you doing here? He didn't respond for a long moment, simply staring at the flame as if he was one of those moronic red priests. Just decided to drop by. HMPH, she grunted disbelievingly. I've been telling Mom over and over not to worry. It's not a big deal. She's not the one who sent me, Ray, he said gently. But I agree with the second thing. She turned towards him, amethyst eyes alight with surprise. Really, he could see Ariane staring too out of the corner of his eye, and smiled at them both in the way that only he could. You're really tough, kiddo, he said simply, as though he was simply stating a fact. Even more than you realize. But this world is big and dangerous, and you never know who might be aiming for your head, hoping to take you out of the game before you ever have the chance to play. So I'll always be supporting that tiny back of yours, and I'll keep you safe for as long as you need me to. They were both quiet for quite a while. Ariane could barely begin to process all the emotions she suddenly felt at that moment, and his words hadn't even been aimed at her. Rhaenys herself would fervently deny that her eyes grew a little misty, and turned away only to wipe something out of them. Idiot. Grinning widely, he stood up and dusted off his pant legs. Come on, it's too early to go back to sleep, let's go have breakfast. And before either could say a word, he was already bouncing out the door. Neither young woman moved for a while. That's the man who brought half of Westeros to heel. Sometimes I still have trouble believing it, Ariane muttered, and Rhaenys glanced over at her cousin with a smile on her face. Liar. AR in the south, in a dingy carriage bumping along a rough road, a pair of green eyes were alight with rage. The owner of those eyes would have screamed at the coachman to be more careful, but knew that everyone around him was tired of his constant tantrums and wouldn't tolerate any such behavior. Joffrey Baratheon had learned well enough by now to keep his anger to himself, despite the fact that he wanted to scream and tear at everything he saw. Ever since the punishment he'd unjustly suffered had ended, he'd been trying harder and harder to get someone to pay the ninja back for every insult and clip to the head he'd endured at the hands of the Kingsguard. Esser Marin Trant, Preston Greenfield and Boros Blunt hadn't dared lay a finger on him, cowards that they were, but Barristan Selmy, Aris Oakheart, Mandon Moore and even his own uncle had done so. His father ignored him the whole time, and his mother, useless whore, simply stared at him sadly and didn't say a word. And yet, despite his fury over his treatment at their hands over the 3 days and nights of sheer torture, his anger wasn't aimed at any of them. Oh, no, his anger was reserved for his true enemy. Naruto Uzumaki. How he hated the name. How he hated the bastard who bore it. How he hated what the savage had done. Was he the only one who could see? Had the rest of the world gone blind? Naruto Uzumaki wielded magic, great magic the likes of which the world hadn't seen since the doom of Illyrio. Even if he called it by a different name, Joffrey wasn't fooled. Did no one see that magic that could tame dragons could easily tame the minds of men? For years his father had interacted with the man, and now followed him around like a lost puppy instead of the proud stag he should have been. In the past few weeks, the man had even stopped drinking and whoring. At that monster's behest, only a scant few hours with the man, and his mother was doing the same. She'd gone from the indulgent, loving parent he remembered to someone he could scarcely recognize. Only a week ago, she'd reprimanded him for a few insults to his pathetic younger brother and only slightly less pathetic sister, as if he was doing something wrong. Naruto had torn down his entire comfortable life, and Joffrey didn't know how to stop it. Even his own dog refused his orders, he thought, remembering the event from weeks ago. XXXXXXX. Ha! Joffrey stared at Sandor Clegane, the Hound, the fearsome lord of House Clegane since the death of his older brother. His humorless guard, who never smiled and enjoyed violence nearly as much as Gregor had. He'd just laughed. Ha! Laughed the Hound again, staring down at the prince in amusement. You must be crazier than I thought. Sputtering in outrage, Joffrey glared up at the tall man. I've given you an order, dog. Even if I can't kill those two northern sluts, I still want the butcher's boy dead. And when Uzumaki finds out, the Hound questioned, grinning down at him with his ugly stained teeth. What then? I am the prince. I am well within my rights to slaughter anyone who challenges me. That boy stood with those whores and attacked me. I want him dead. That foreigner can't do anything to hurt me. Perhaps not, Sandor conceded, though his grin didn't go away. But he sure as hell can do something to hurt me. You will be acting on the prince's orders, dog. The barbarian wouldn't dare do anything to stop you. Sandor's grin actually faded as he once again lamented accepting this position. Should have retired to spend the rest of his life in Essos, fighting and drinking, right after tearing down his family's castle stone by stone, of course. Better by far than sitting around as babysitter for this prancing princely ponce. Even if there was a mummer's chance that that was true, I still wouldn't take any action against Uzumaki. I owe him, after all. And Sandor did. Anyone who could have made his brother's head explode wasn't someone he would ever take up arms against. More likely he'd buy the man a drink. Joffrey, on hearing this, grew even redder as his rage almost robbed him of words. I'll have your head for this, dog. Ha! The Hound chuckled, his grin even wider this time. Bigger men than you have tried, little prince. Maybe one day you might manage to use those womanly arms of yours to stick a dagger in my neck, but until then, I'm staying right here. Get someone else to kill butcher's boys for you. XXXXXXX. Narrowing his eyes as he remembered the scene, Joffrey gritted his teeth as he struggled to keep himself from lashing out and ripping the stuffing of the carriage to pieces. Then, slowly, he mastered himself. It wouldn't do to make a big scene. He could feel eyes on him, even alone in the carriage as he was. Everyone constantly staring at him when they should be bowing in reverence. Another surge of anger shot through him, but he calmed down quickly. After all, he still had to plan his revenge. Revenge sounded sweet indeed, and Joffrey managed to console himself with images of Naruto Uzumaki's bloody, broken body laid out before him like a prize. Perhaps he'd have the limbs torn off and served to the northern sluts at a feast. Or maybe pluck out his single eye and wear it from a necklace. Yes, he thought, unbothered by the tent in his trousers. That does sound nice, but he must move quietly. The ninja had eyes and ears everywhere. Some said that there were even more of those disgusting clones of his, wearing the skins of ordinary folk and even nobles, polluting the country with his vile magic. And with his mother no longer supporting him, yes. The only person Joffrey could trust was himself. So he settled in, and prepared himself. This would be a long undertaking, but he had plenty of time. XXXXXXX. Even farther south, far from any thought of bloodshed and revenge, among the sand dunes and mountains of Dorne, Doran Martell sighed very loudly. Dinner was always a lively event whenever his little brother decided to drop by from wherever he'd been traveling to, and whenever he brought one or several of his daughters, as he'd done tonight, and the entire place could turn from the respectable dining hall of the wondrous water gardens into the half-mad, mouth-stuffing, food-fighting mess that he was currently watching. He laid almost the entire blame for that on the blonde that was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the table, reading a large tome and batting aside flying food with a fork without even looking. The first time Naruto had ever been invited to dinner with them, Doria Sand, the second youngest of a baron's 8 daughters, had decided to fling a piece of fruit at his head, nearly causing Doran to have a heart attack, only for the man to dodge and cause the fruit to bounce off the back of a baron's head. Turning around and seeing the boy laughing at him, he'd plucked another and flung it in retaliation, only to be dodged again, and the rest was history. Far from being offended as Doran had initially feared, Naruto seemed to find the whole thing hilarious, and challenged every member of the family to try and hit him even once, claiming that they might as well try to leave a footprint on water. But his relatives were nothing if not precocious, and accepted the challenge with wide grins. Even Ariane and Rhaenys occasionally got in on the action, though this time they had wisely taken cover behind Naruto, who blocked everything coming their way. Even now he could see the result, and promptly ducked under a flying slice of bread. Even his guards seemed quite amused at the whole thing. Traitors. Smacking aside a chicken bone with a handy ear of corn, Naruto held up a hand. Okay, Okay, that's enough for now. Don't want your uncle to have an aneurysm, and I am actually trying to read this. Arianne snuck her head above his shoulder to stare down at the book in his lap. I doubt if I've ever seen you with a book that didn't have food or fighting in it. What exactly are you so interested in? Rhaenys, speaking from his other side, grinned wickedly and spoke before he could answer. It's a book about sex. Illyrio spat out a mouthful of water. Dorne choked on a chicken and a Baron inhaled a biscuit. Naruto, of course, was too dignified to do any such thing, and simply gave her a half-hearted glare from the corner of his eye. Obara, Nymeria and Tyene all swiveled in their chairs to try to get a look. Then Tyene turned to look up at Dorne with wide, innocent eyes, somewhat betrayed by the small smirk she was sporting. Uncle, what sex? His jaw working uncontrollably for several seconds, the Lord of Sunspear tried desperately to think of something to say while a Baron laughed so hard he toppled off his chair. Oberyn. Dorne roared, then switched his gaze to the younger man in the room. Naruto, she's kidding, Dory, he said, chuckling ruefully. Geez, one would think that you lacked a sense of humor. That is not the sort of humor that I want in my household. Naruto chuckled, turning a page. Oh, relax, you may not have gout anymore, but keep that up and you'll get a heart condition. That's not so easily fixed. Narrowing his eyes, Dorne barely managed to keep his temper under control, enough not to yell anymore. The fact that Naruto had successfully managed to cure his gout back when it had first appeared was an event that still amazed him, and something a Baron never let him forget. But he was still going to give Rhaenys, and Tyene, a stern talking to later. So what's the book actually about? Obara asked. A collection of tales of the mysterious land of Yi, by Archmaester Yandel, he replied, staring at the spine of the worn book, before shrugging and going back to reading. Just perusing. They all looked at him, more than a little confused. Yi wasn't a common subject in Westeros. Why are you so interested? Nymeria asked. From the little I've read and heard about the place, it seems somewhat similar to my homeland, he mentioned casually, shrugging again. I don't know. I guess I'm just curious. Every person in the room paused at this. Then Obara looked over at him. What was your home like? She asked softly. Naruto's eye flicked over to meet her gaze, before he looked out the window. Violent, usually. Where I came from, chakra wasn't an unusual phenomenon, so we learned many different ways to be dangerous. Some chose strength, others used their minds. Some reached for a higher goal, and some just hunted for blood. Some could barely move a leaf, some could shatter mountains. Some wanted to seek fellowship, some could destroy entire villages. He smiled, then, his hair shining in the sunlight. And some were devoted to ideals of peace. Some were loyal to their dying breath to family, friends, village, or code. And some, the really special ones, still managed to find love in spite of the world they lived in. For a while, there was silence in the room. Even the guards were staring in wonderment at Naruto as he finished speaking. Rhaenys, who'd been silent for a while, put her hand on his arm, meeting his gaze with her purple eyes. And which were you? He raised an eyebrow with a small smile. I've been all of those things, Ray. You'll have to be more specific. I mean, she said, then paused, struggling to find out what she was asking. Was there anyone like you? Anyone who was, I mean, people who used strength or wit to fight. I've killed several, people who strove for peace. Every sensei I ever had always wanted that, even if they tried to hide it. Those who were loyal to a cause. I've fought with and against people like that, people who searched for love. Here he smiled, though everyone could tell that it wasn't a happy one. I've had the privilege, and misfortune, to know a few. For a little while, the room was quiet. Then Dorne spoke up, both curious and concerned. And people who could shatter mountains, destroy villages, were they rare? Naruto glanced over at him with a chuckle. I could name a dozen just off the top of my head. And I've fought against most of them. Every adult in the room was pale by now, but the younger women all huddled closer, staring at him with inquisitive eyes. Arianne got the closest, looking up at him from the table's edge. How did you survive? Do you really want to know? He asked, staring at each of them. One by one, they all nodded. Naruto sighed in resignation, leapt off the table and closed his eyes, slowly lifting his shirt to expose his abdomen, making them all blush. Then he put his other hand in a half-ram seal, and focused his chakra. Obara, Nymeria, Tyene, Arianne and Rhaenys all gasped as what looked like an enormous tattoo slowly appeared on his stomach. He slowly opened his eye to reveal the Rinnegan, blazing purple. Because the most powerful demon ever to exist is currently sitting pretty locked inside my gut. As his gaze swept through all of them, and it suddenly felt as if the weight of a castle were on their shoulders. Letting them feel a taste of his power was enough, then Naruto began to pull it back, closing his eye and letting out a breath from between clenched teeth. Seeing him breathe out a puff of smoke didn't make the occupants of the room any less tense. Of course, that's only one reason, he said calmly, feeling like his nerves had been soaked in magma. Like everything that involves people and their relationships, it was complicated. A few minutes passed as everyone digested what they'd just heard. Naruto looked around, saw the expressions that everyone was sporting and gave a small, pained laugh. You can see why I don't like telling people about my world. Tends to freak people out. Then, to his surprise, someone took his hand. He looked up to see Rhaenys glaring at him with watery eyes. For a few seconds, she tried to say something, but the words seemed to catch every time she opened her mouth. Finally, she settled for clinging to him and burying her face in his chest. He finally reciprocated and held her close, surprised. I think what my cute little cousin is trying to say, Arianne said softly, her dark eyes glimmering, is that you'll have to try harder if you want to scare us away, you big dummy. She leaned into him, putting an arm around him and another around Rhaenys. Naruto looked up at the rest of the room, seeing everyone smiling or nodding in agreement, and managed a small chuckle. Even you, Dorne, you're not one to be so calm when talking about scary things. The older man stared at him with a raised eyebrow. You saved my only sister. There's nothing you could say that would make me consider turning against you. Then, as that was sinking in, he gave Naruto a significant look. Though your choice of reading topics can be a bane on my patience. As everyone laughed at that, both Rhaenys and Arianne finally pulled away from their shared embrace, both looking strangely unhappy at the loss. Everyone sat down, though both the young Dornishwomen sat quite a bit closer to Naruto than before. With the normal mood restored, Illyrio simply smirked at her paramour's brother, before switching her gaze over to the only blonde in the room. Speaking on that, I'm impressed you managed to hold in your surprise. Glancing at all three of the other adults in the room and the various food items they had spewed over the table at Rhaenys' joke, he smirked. I'll have you know that I am more than capable of holding in my surprise, no matter the question. As the rest of the family went back to searching for snacks, Rhaenys turned and looked at Naruto with wide, curious eyes. I have a question, then, she asked as he looked around for something to drink to wash out the taste of ash. The golden-haired young man paused for a second and gave her a long look. Go ahead, he said with a grin, finally pulling a goblet towards himself and taking a long drink from it. Rhaenys nodded, opened her mouth, paused, and then finally asked. Are you fucking my mother? His resulting spit take blasted a Baron right out of his chair. For a few seconds, everything was quiet except for Naruto's stammering and a Baron's cursing. Rhaenys nodded at this. That's what I figured, she said, standing up. Then, without another word, she took hold of Naruto's chin, stood on her toes and kissed him right on the lips. As the rest of the room found their jaws dropping, the young man's eye widened comically at the unexpected situation his lips found themselves in when they finally parted for air. Rhaenys nodded in satisfaction, her sparkling purple eyes alight with amusement. I won't lose to anyone, especially not that thieving old hag. He mumbled, too stunned to respond to the good-humored slight against Elia. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched out of the room, leaving a room full of people still in a state of shock. Arianne, meanwhile, looked after her cousin in consternation. With a huff, she shook out her hair, making it gleam maroon in the sunlight. As usual, Rhaenys has to steal my thunder. Before Naruto could do much more than switch his gaze over to her, still looking as if he'd just drank a mountain's worth of alcohol, she swept down and stole a kiss too. She lingered only a bit longer than Rhaenys, officially short-circuiting Naruto's brain. After a long moment, she parted from him. Have fun in King's Landing, she said impishly and followed after her cousin with a swish of skirts and a laugh. The succession of shocks finally proved too much for the ninja, who toppled backwards off the table in a dead faint. The combination of landing on his head and the preceding events of the hour were quite enough to make the clone dispel, which it did in a larger than usual puff of smoke. Sitting at the table of food, most of which had largely been ignored by now, Dorne, a Baron and Illyrio simply stared after the three who had recently vacated the room. I don't know whether to be angry or impressed, a Baron muttered. He was well known as being a lover of the fairer sex, but even he couldn't boast of having two princesses express their interest in him, let alone at the same time. Oh dear, Illyrio sighed. I think they broke your brother. Oh god, Dorne gurgled unintelligibly. XXXXXXX. Half the continent away, in the capital building of Naruto City, the real him and Ashara Dane relaxed. Both of them had been sitting in their shared bedroom inside the city that Naruto had made, though the name of the city was something they still couldn't agree on. Naruto was in the midst of reading a few reports from several spies he had scattered around the Seven Kingdoms. Ashara, on the other hand, was settled comfortably on the bed, dressed in a thin gown of Myrish silk, reading a book and pretending that she didn't notice the glances that Naruto had been sending her way as she stretched and rolled around, trying to find the most comfortable position. The smooth material shifting over her curves was mesmerizing, the silk shimmering as she gave a breathy sigh of contentment. "What the hell, Gia?" she yelped, jumping at Naruto's sudden shout. Her surprise turned to anger in half a second. "What is wrong with you? Don't scare me like that," she said, her violet eyes sparkling in outrage. When he didn't respond other than gaping at the wall, she started to get concerned. "Naruto, what's going on?" Before she could blink, he had flashed across the room, held her by the shoulders and stared right into her eyes. "Ashara, I have something that I need to ask you." She replied intelligently. "Okay, if you were suddenly kissed by the daughter of the woman you are currently sleeping with, what would you do?" Her eyes widened. You mean, yeah, you mean she, yes, so she actually, yes." The lost lady of the House of Dane stared at Naruto. Then, to his consternation, she laughed. "Good girl, I've taught her well." His jaw worked unintelligibly for several moments. Before he could speak, the violet-eyed woman smirked. Slowly standing up from where she'd been laying on the soft bed, Ashara sauntered over to where he was sitting on the plush cushions of the sofa. Without a word, she settled herself in his lap, feeling the hard length beneath her thigh give a little jump as she put her arms around his neck. His hardness grew still harder as her breasts pressed harder against his chest and she kissed him softly on the lips, smirking into his mouth as his hands made their way to her ass. As they separated for air and Ashara drew back, she couldn't help but smirk at the glazed look in his eye. "So, what should I do?" he mumbled, not entirely sure what to make of this situation. "You're making things needlessly complicated," she admonished, tapping a finger on his nose. His jaw dropped at that. "I'm making things complicated?" He sputtered. "I didn't decide to kiss her. Hell, I don't even know what Rey was thinking when she made that decision. Regardless, she did kiss you." "Yeah, but," he was interrupted as the finger on his nose slid down over his mouth. Ashara's sparkling eyes stared into his, her smirk easing into a contented grin. "We're Dornish, Naruto," she murmured. "The rest of this country may be filled with nothing but shriveled old prudes, but we take pride in our way of life. Being open, honest and true to your feelings is something that no Dornishman or woman would ever judge you for. You care about Rhaenys, don't you?" "Of course I do," he hurriedly replied. "I care about her a lot, but I practically helped raise her. If I hadn't gotten younger when I came to this world, I would be physically old enough to be her father. I still am old enough to be her father. PSH, she said, waving off his concern with a wave of her hand. Rhaenys never saw you as a father, not even once. She told me so herself. Given what her actual father did to his family, I'm not surprised." Naruto quieted a little at that. He wasn't surprised either. Rhaenys' hatred for her father and her father's family was almost legendary among the few people who knew she still lived. Any time their name was brought up in conversation, the young woman's fury was quite something to behold. Shaking his head to clear it of those thoughts, he brought his attention back to the topic at hand. I'm just not sure if it's right," he finally said, deflating a little. Ashara snorted. Like hell was she going to let those sorts of thoughts take root in that thick skull of his? Right, according to who? The Septons in their marble halls, the maesters with their knowledge and books. Come now, Naruto, I know you're too smart to let those pathetic old men claim what's right for this world, let alone what's right for you. After a few seconds as the rebellious parts of his mind howled in agreement, he simply stared off into space. But who would be okay with this? He finally asked, grasping at straws. Ashara smirked, unnoticed in his distracted state, and played her trump card. Elia would. His head swiveled so fast she was worried that he'd get whiplash, his single eye wide in disbelief. She flipped her hair. Don't look so surprised. You know quite well that Elia can play the part of a courtly lady when it suits her. And you also know that in the bedchamber she's even wilder than I am. He slowly nodded. Sometimes the things Elia liked to do when they were alone surprised even him. Ashara settled further into his lap, kissing along his jawline as her hands ran up and down his muscled abdomen. Does it really surprise you so that Elia would trust you with her daughter's honor? After everything you've done for us? Then, before he could respond, she stopped moving and looked him sharply in the eye. Do you intend to take advantage of her? Of course not, he snarled. The very idea of anyone doing anything of the sort made his chakra want to lash out in rage. Ashara enjoyed the smoldering look in his eye as his body tensed, then kissed him gently as he slowly relaxed into her embrace. Then why is it so strange that Elia would see the same? She trusts you, Naruto, just as I do. Rhaenys may be young, but she's twice as smart as both Elia and I combined, and twice as stubborn, too. You know what happens when someone tries to persuade her to give up a course of action, she'll do it anyway just to spite them. We trust her to act wisely and not rush into things. And we trust you to be perfectly respectful and to protect her to the best of your ability. I'll always protect her, he said quietly. To my dying breath. She shivered, tingles running up and down her spine as she leaned in with eyes darkened with desire. And you wonder why we love you so much, and kissed him. They both enjoyed that for a few minutes, until a moment's separation made Naruto remember something else. Ariane kissed me too. Ashara's jaw dropped at that, before she started laughing again. You are going to be an object of jealousy for the rest of your life. He groaned at that, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Figures. Can't ever be simple in this world, can it? Nope, she replied cheerfully, then drew closer until they were inches apart. But I have a feeling I know how to distract you. Feeling him perk right back up beneath her, Ashara smirked into her lover's lips. Good boy, the stinging slap on her ass was well worth it. In the east, there existed several city-states of varying repute. In Pentos, along the western coast bordering the narrow sea, a fat man was running. In fact, he was running in a panic. This would normally be a sight that would make every one of his servants goggle at him in shock. The sight of Illyrio Mopatis, one of the wealthiest merchants of Pentos, swinging his immense bulk back and forth as he did his best impression of a sprint would have made anyone stare. Especially as he was in his own manse, at that. But Illyrio had a perfectly rational explanation for why he was in such a rush. He was being chased by a monster. Now, of course, anyone who heard this might have scoffed. But although monsters weren't a common sight in this part of the world, it didn't mean that they didn't exist. And he just so happened to have pissed off the worst of them. Slamming the door to his personal study open and squeezing through the door, he staggered over to a shelf and pulled at one of the books upon it. A corresponding click sounded from inside the wall, along with the shifting of immense gears. The entire section of the wall shifted and pulled apart, revealing the immense tumblers of the vault door leading to his personal panic room. Complete with the immensely thick walls, made of sheets of steel, along with rations to last a year and his personal water supply, he could survive here for quite a long time, safe from all threats. Collapsing into his comfortable chair as the door swung closed again, the weighted tumblers shifting back into place, he finally breathed a sigh of relief. He stayed that way for a few minutes, trying to catch his breath. It had been a moonlit night in Pentos, when he'd heard a commotion from the front gates. Wondering who had dared to cause a ruckus in front of his manse, he'd looked out the window to see what was going on only to spot a head of golden hair, flashing in the moonlight as his gate guards were slaughtered to a man. For a long time among the powerful men of the world, there had always been rumors about the monster who took up residence in the barbaric north of Westeros. How he'd almost single-handedly guaranteed Robert Baratheon's victory against the venerable Targaryen dynasty. But more than those, there were other rumors. About what happened to noble houses and families who managed to catch the beast's attention. About how he would appear in the dead of night, without warning, and strike without mercy at those who had turned from the path of righteousness. Naturally, Illyrio himself and most of his fellows scoffed at this. One didn't achieve anything in this world unless they were willing to get their hands dirty. It had been that way for millennia, and wasn't likely to change anytime soon, and certainly not at the whim of this righteous no-name upstart. Well, Illyrio thought bitterly. That's what I thought, at least. He should have taken the spider's advice. At least I'm safe here, he said out loud, sinking deeper into his chair. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Came an amused voice from behind him. The elderly cheesemonger's eyes snapped open, even as he barely resisted the urge to spin around and the even bigger urge to scream like a little girl. Instead he spoke, with only the smallest tremble to his voice. Do you have any business with me? Business? The voice asked, sounding even more amused at the ill-disguised terror in Illyrio's tone. There's no business I would conduct with the likes of you. I know quite well what sorts of things you get up to in your spare time. What you enjoy, what you trade. Wincing at that, the nobleman swallowed a few times to try to speak. In that case, I would ask why. Why indeed, the voice demurred, still sounding uncomfortably cheerful. To his horror, a hand settled on his shoulder. Though in an ideal world I would have made sure you had an unfortunate accident whilst you walked down the stairs, right now I need information. Information which I am quite hopeful, he said even as the hand tightened enough to make Illyrio wince, you will be able to provide. Wah, what information? Oh, a small thing. A business transaction, between an exiled prince and a Dothraki warlord some days ago. Of particular concern is what was bartered. Or rather, who? Sweat dripped down Illyrio's brow. Now, normally, I may have simply slaughtered near everyone involved and walked away, but in this case, that isn't an option. For one, I doubt the spider would be pleased with me if I took one of his pieces off the board, even one as useless as you. For another. The voice hissed in his ear this time, making goosebumps appear on his arm as he tried not to piss himself. There is an interested party who asked me to make sure that both the princess and her brat of a brother were kept safe. Having fulfilled one part of that request, I simply need to ask one simple thing of you. Illyrio tried to quell his fear, and barely managed to ask. What? Then, before he could do more than gasp, a hand seized the back of his chair and spun it around so fast that he almost flew off. And as he came face to face with Naruto Uzumaki, the cheesemonger audibly gulped. A dark look had settled over the ninja's face, and despite his apparent youth, Illyrio couldn't help but shiver. An unnatural cold had settled in the room, but that wasn't what was so disturbing. There was rage in that eye. Whilst they were under your roof, did Viserys touch her? He tried, Illyrio managed after trying to speak through his dry throat. He was caught the night before the wedding by Jorah Mormont, trying to sneak into her room. He was drunk, and angry, saying things that were, well, disturbing. Jorah Mormont, Naruto sneered. He had a whole host of issues with that man, but that could wait. At the moment, he had a much fatter fish to fry. I'm sure you understand by now how easy it would be for you to meet with some unfortunate accident, yes? The nobleman's head swiveled up and down. Yes, Naruto reached up with a single hand and pointed at his own nose, his teeth glinting in the candlelight. Do you ever want to see this face again? This time the head shook rather vigorously. That's what I thought. Just don't forget, Naruto muttered, as a darkness seemed to spring into exist behind him, wearing the face of a terrible one-eyed demon. I'll be watching. Then he disappeared, leaving behind only a terrified man in the cold and the dark. XXXXXXX. Far away, in a heaving ship bound for the northern coast of Westeros, two purple eyes suddenly blinked awake. Daenerys Targaryen, one of only two members of the Targaryen dynasty left, stared up at the wooden beam above her head and wondered how she had come to be in this position. It was only 2 weeks before that she was about to enter into a marriage with a savage she didn't know, at the order from a brother she now despised, at the behest of a fat old man who stank of perfume and sweat. And indeed, it wasn't that long ago that she had ridden off on a horse with her new husband, to perform her wifely duties, ignoring the fact that she was only 16. And that she was filled with nothing but utter terror at the thought of what she'd been ordered to do only for something to happen that she hadn't counted on. They were interrupted. XXXXXXX. Tears trickled down her cheeks as rough hands slowly slipped up her arms. Hot breath tickled along the back of her neck where Khal Drogo was standing, pressed against her naked back. He smelled of horse and leather and blood. His hands squeezed just a bit harder on her arms, grunting impatiently. Dany choked out a sob, and slowly started to lower her hands. Oi! Both of them looked up, startled at the interruption. No Dothraki would dare interrupt the Khal's wedding night, and no foreigner would have been allowed anywhere near them. A young man stood before them, a single eye glaring from under spiky blonde hair. Daenerys stared at his odd sandals, tunic and trousers. Most off-putting was the high-collared, dark red coat he wore, black flames blazing along the edges of the material. I'll thank you to take your hands off the girl, he said, his head tilted to the side as he regarded the Khal with a flinty gaze. Drogo growled, for this young foreigner to dare give orders to him was an insult. To do it on a sacred night like this made that insult all the worse. With barely a thought, he shoved Dany aside harshly, letting her stumble with a small cry, landing on the rough ground, leaving her to try to cover herself with her discarded dress. Hands curled into claws, Drogo approached the stupid boy in a rage. He twisted, bringing a fist back to strike. What happened next was too fast for him to process. Few people would have been able to follow the flurry of punches that slammed into the Khal's frame in the next 3 seconds, and fewer would have been able to withstand them. Suffice to say, when Drogo hit the ground, he was already unconscious. Daenerys gasped when her erstwhile husband hit the ground, and stared at the man who'd done it. His intense gaze switched over to her. Without a word, he walked a few steps her way, and raised his hands, making her flinch and close her eyes. Seconds later, she felt a weight settle around her shoulders, and opened them again to find his red coat draped over her shoulders. Staring at him uncomprehendingly, Daenerys tried to think of something to say. Well, he asked, crouching down, a kind smile on his face, his single eye twinkling merrily. You gonna sit around here all day? XXXXXXX. That event had been weeks ago, and she had not, in fact, sat around there all day. Daenerys closed her eyes and leaned back into the soft pillow, listening to the pitch and roll of waves against the hull. Following his appearance, the Targaryen girl had panicked, wondering what would happen when Drogo woke up and roused the Khalasar, fearing that her savior would be killed and that she and her brother might share his fate. But the man had simply laughed, waving off her concerns. Then, to her shock, he put a hand on her shoulder, and they were suddenly on the deck of a ship, far out to sea. And her fear swelled even more as she suddenly realized in that moment who the man was. Naruto Uzumaki. Viserys had long warned her about those who had thrown down their house. Robert Baratheon, bloodthirsty warmonger. Tywin Lannister, traitorous bastard. Eddard Stark, merciless dog. But there was one that he warned of above all others. The foreign magician, the demon in the dark, the monster. She was sharing a ship with him. She'd listened to him laugh. And he was the one who had saved her from the man she'd been married off to. The contradiction in her mind was one that she was struggling with, even now, and all that was compounded by what he'd said when she asked him where they were being taken. An interested party would like to see you, he'd said mysteriously to Dany and her brother. They'd both stiffened, thinking of several men in Westeros who would be interested in seeing them dead. But, to their surprise, Naruto had waved off their concerns. Don't worry, it's not anyone you're thinking of. In fact, for some reason, the blonde had seemed amused at their confusion. So now she waited and wondered, at what they would find across the sea. A shrill shout echoed through the cabin walls, and she gave a sigh of consternation. Viserys had been an absolute pain for the entire trip. At first, he'd simply milled about, even paler than usual, not daring to say a word. Once it became clear that neither Naruto nor none of the sailors on the ship would harm him, he'd reverted right back to his old self. When he wasn't loudly complaining about the pitch and roll of the heavy seas, he was making various disdainful remarks about the quality of his cabin and the food they both received. She was well used to it by now, but noted with some trepidation how many glares her brother was getting from the crew. Naruto was often relaxing in the crow's nest or helping some sailors with tasks that required strength, but even under his watchful eye, she couldn't help but worry. Targaryens had died more ignobly than being stabbed in their beds. After all beginning the process of dressing herself, Dany finally made her way out of her cabin onto the deck. It was daytime, and the sun shone over the startling blue waves. Several sailors were in the midst of sanding the deck, while others adjusted the sails to catch the wind. It was an uncommonly large ship that they were sailing on, nearly 50 meters from end to end. A frigate, which meant 3 sails, she'd learned. They swelled with the breeze above her, making the ship pitch to the right, or starboard. The captain had seemed to delight in answering questions, when she asked, which was an unusual experience. The look of pride when he spoke of his ship, the Windstride, was obvious. The fastest in the world, he'd called it, a brand new, revolutionary design. Suffice to say, her entire time aboard this ship had been surreal, to say the least. Men gave salutes as she walked past, tapping their knuckles to their foreheads and making way as she walked along the deck. Even now, days after she'd been brought aboard, she was still getting used to being treated in such a way. At Illyrio's manse and at several places where she and her brother had been welcomed, they'd always received the finest clothes and food. Every guest they'd met had always been the very picture of nobility, jeweled and illustrious. But Dany wasn't blind. She'd seen the way they always put her to the wayside, making all the time to flatter and smile at her brother, who soaked in the attention like a dry sponge, even as she was passed from one person to the next, seizing her company at any point to regale her with tales of their achievements or twirl her around the dance floor. And the way some of the men looked at her, suffice to say, Khal Drogo was not the first man whose hands had wandered. Now, though, these sailors, common folk to a man, simply offered their respect. They treated her like a princess. It was eye-opening, to say the least. It didn't escape her notice that not one of them had done the same for her brother the few times he left his cabin. Finally coming to the end of the deck, she seized the guardrails flanking the steep steps and pulled herself up to the quarterdeck, where the ship's wheel was located and where most of the officers on duty spent their time overlooking the rest of the ship. A small misstep almost made her fall, but a hand seized her wrist at the last moment and steadied her. The hand itself was missing several fingers, and she looked up into the kind eyes of the man who it belonged to. "Thank you, Captain," she said with a small smile. "You're quite welcome, Your Highness," Davos Seaworth answered with a wide smile of his own. "I know ship stairs can be difficult to navigate sometimes." "It's no trouble, sir," she demurred, standing beside him and leaning her hands against the railing. "What's no trouble?" Proud of herself for managing not to flinch, Dany turned her head to look at Naruto's upside-down face. He hung like a monkey from the nearest sail, grinning from ear to ear as he swayed with the movement of the ship. "Nothing, milord, just making sure the little lady kept her footing," Davos responded, even as he looked up at the blonde man dangling from the sail. "And how many times have I told you not to climb on the rigging? I don't need you breaking something and making more work for my crew. How many times have I told you, I'm not a lord? I'm not even a knight, of the hedge or landed variety, he said, amused despite himself. Besides, I'm hardly making more work for the crew. I haven't even damaged anything. Half a second later, there was a sound of tearing rope, and Naruto, with a surprised look, dropped from the sail and thumped face first into the deck. Oh, dear, Davos muttered, his lips twitching. Faulty rigging, that, it seems one of those ropes was improperly maintained. I wonder how such a thing could have happened. Are you okay? Dany asked, kneeling at his side, her violet eyes wide with worry. And to her even greater surprise, the blonde turned over and burst out laughing. Ha ha ha, I'm impressed, Davos, it ain't often that someone gets one over on me. Then as his chuckles tapered off, he glanced at the young woman still kneeling at his side. No worries, Dany, I'm all good. As she realized she was still been sitting next to him, she got to her feet in a hurry, a small blush lighting her cheeks. Why did him saying her name like that have to make her stomach flutter? Even as she stepped away, he pulled his legs across his chest and kicked up, landing smoothly on his feet with hardly a sound. Davos snorted, show off, and proud of it, Naruto replied smugly. You're just jealous. In your dreams, the knight scoffed. You're about a foot shorter than a person's supposed to be. Least I've still got all my digits, half hand, he replied, flashing all 10 fingers. For a moment, Dany almost worried that things would dissolve into a fight, but they both just burst out laughing all over again. She sighed. This ship was just bizarre. Then came a shout from above them. On deck there, land ho. They all looked up at the sailor, Davos cupping a hand to his mouth. Where away? 2 points off the port beam, Esser. About 3 leagues distant. Walking across to the left side of the deck, Davos looked through the Myrish glass his lieutenant handed him and nodded in approval. And there's the mountain range you spoke of. I see it, Naruto said, grinning. Well done, Esser Seaworth. You never fail to impress. Thank you, milord. Naruto, damn you, my name is Naruto, as you say, milord. Bah, the blonde scoffed, waving off the elderly sailor, who walked away with a grin and began ordering the ship to make ready to drop anchor, leaving Dany alone with Naruto. She began, trying to think of what to call him. Despite his repeated attempts to get people to call him by his given name, she hesitated in doing so. What's up, little lady, he said, a slight teasing tone to his voice. Blushing at the effrontery, she tilted her chin up and looked him in the eye, like she'd been taught. Where are you taking us? Who are you taking us to? You've kept my brother and I in the dark during this entire trip. Why did we have to sail here, if you could have brought us here in an instant? He was silent for a few long moments as he regarded her. She quailed a little under his searching gaze, but kept her back straight. Several reasons, he finally answered. I am taking you to a place where you will be safe. The reason I kept you and your brother in the dark, is that I didn't want to spoil the surprise. And the reason I didn't simply teleport you to where we were going. Well, I thought you needed some time. What do you mean? She asked, honestly confused. I thought you needed some time to relax in a place where your brother does not hold sway, he said, his sky-blue eye twinkling in the sunlight, even as his smile became a bit more strained. It has not escaped my notice how he likes to treat you. I don't know what you're talking about, she mumbled, her eyes lowering to the ground. A rough hand took hold of her chin, and she stiffened, unsure of what to expect. But the hand simply raised her head back up. Yes you do, he said softly, his single eye glowing unnaturally bright. Rest assured, Daenerys, you have nothing to fear whilst under my roof. Not from me, not from those in Westeros who may wish you harm. And certainly not from your brother. Her breath hitched a little as she listened, and kept her chin up even as his hand fell away, her violet eyes wide. I understand, she breathed. He closed his eye and took a deep breath, stepping away as he did. Good then, you should get below decks and pack your things. Once you are ready, we will go. She turned away and started walking before she remembered a question that he hadn't really answered. Where are we going? He grinned at the question. To my city. You and Viserys will be my guests for the foreseeable future. Then, with a turn, he hopped down the stairs and walked away. Can't wait to show it off. Made the place myself, you know. Dany looked after him, bewildered. What does he mean, he made it himself? Several minutes later, she was standing on deck, a few bags with a few personal possessions already in a boat over the side, where several sailors were waiting to row them ashore. Viserys was loudly threatening a group of men not to drop his things, even though they were already taking the utmost care. Davos and Naruto rolled their eyes in unison. Is there something wrong, ma'am? A sailor asked, startling her. Well, she responded, unsure of how to respond. After all, the only way down to the boat was to climb down, and she was wearing a dress. Oh dear, Davos said as he realized the problem. Not to worry, milady, we'll have that sorted in a moment. You there, prepare a rig to lower her ladyship down. No need, Naruto interrupted, stepping closer. He hooked an arm beneath her knees and picked her in a bridal carry, making her face turn scarlet as she let out a startled squeak. And, before anyone could think to stop him, he jumped over the side, carrying Dany in his arms. A chorus of shouts emanated from the crew, even as her shriek joined them. Realizing in half a second that he'd overshot the boat and that they were about to land in the water, she closed her eyes and waited to get soaked. To the surprise of all watching, nothing of the sort happened. Slowly, Dany opened her eyes, and looked out over the ocean. For a second, she was confused, until she looked down. Naruto was standing on the water. Whilst the sailors on the deck above them continued to gape in disbelief, he simply turned and gently laid her in the center of the longboat. She stared up at him uncomprehendingly as he rose up and down with the ocean water. See you on shore, little lady, he said with a grin. Have a nice trip. Her mouth opened and closed a few times. Above them, Davos finally got over his own shock to realize that the entire crew was staring over the side. Oi, there's still work to be done. Back to your posts, you lazy bastards. With many grumbles, they all trickled away, though many would be sharing their stories once they got some shore leave. Scarcely anyone noticed Viserys, who was unusually quiet even as he descended to join his sister in the boat. With a toss of their oars, the longboat began to move away from the ship, heading towards shore. For a while, the only sound on the ship was the pattering of feet on wood planks and the gentle lap of waves against the hull. What Naruto did next made Davos raise his eyebrow even higher. Sticking out a foot from where he was still standing on the water, the ninja pressed it to the hull and began walking up the side of the ship. I'm too old for this, the Onion Knight muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Ah, don't say that, Davy, Naruto said, looking amused. Who else can I count on for all my secret boat trips? It's not a boat, it's a ship, the man growled half-heartedly. And my name isn't Davy. Chuckling, the blonde glanced out over the waves, idly making sure that the longboat was still on its way. Then he turned back and stuck out his left hand. Always a pleasure. Noting the gesture, Davos grinned, reached out with the hand that still had fingers and shook. The pleasure is mine. As Naruto turned away and hopped onto the railing, the captain stopped him with a question. Are you sure you know what you're doing, with those two? Some very powerful men won't be happy with you for bringing them here. The blonde scoffed. Some very powerful women will be even more unhappy with me if I don't. Besides, she made me promise to keep them safe, and I will. The former smuggler raised an eyebrow. And who, exactly, is she? A rather impressive woman, all told, Naruto said seriously, tapping a finger to his chin. You'd have to be, to survive being married to Aerys Targaryen. And, as Davos goggled at him, Naruto simply grinned and gave him a jaunty wave. Toodaloo. And he faded from sight. XXXXXXX. A long way away, in a room that even Elia and Ashara had not been made aware of, a pair of startling violet eyes blinked open. The owner of those eyes gave a small groan as sleep once again eluded her. Even now, memories of fire and blood still gripped her mind, even though she appeared to the empty room as the picture of calm. Long silvery tresses fell down her face as Rhaella Targaryen sat up in bed, putting a hand to her forehead to try and settle the ache in her skull. Though she was now 54 years old, not a hint of her advanced age showed in her bearing or appearance. She might have been mistaken for a woman 20 years younger. A knock at the door made her tense for a moment, but she forced herself to relax. Come in, she said softly. Gently, the door opened, though not all the way. Are you decent? I am wearing clothes, if that's what you mean. With exaggerated care, Naruto stepped through the door, though he looked away quickly once he caught sight of her, cheeks going a little bit red. A nightgown isn't exactly what I meant. She shrugged. The fabric may have been rather thin, but it was comfortable. It wasn't as if anyone needed to worry about getting cold. Naruto's city was layered with seals to keep the warmth in. Rhaella settled back into the pillows, looking out the window at the buildings below. The center of the city where her daughter-in-law and her friend stayed was in easy view. As always, I find myself impressed with all that you have accomplished, she said. Naruto floundered for a few seconds as he tried to think of something to say. Thank you. She tilted her head in a quick nod of acknowledgement. I take it my children are on their way here. They should arrive within the hour. Help me up. The young man stepped forward and did so, gently putting one arm around her waist and putting hers over his shoulder, helping her to stand. She sniffed once as he got close. You've been fucking Elia and Ashara again, haven't you? His cheeks reddened at the casual question. How can you tell? She waved off his question. Their scent is very distinctive. Grow up in King's Landing and anything that doesn't smell of shit is a novel experience. I imagine it would be, he said, amused. They exited the room, moving slowly, one step at a time. It took them both a few minutes to arrive at the common room, where Naruto helped her into a chair. He couldn't hide the concern in his eyes. Are you okay? You should still be resting. Her purple eyes sharpened as she looked up at him. I was in a coma for 15 years, Naruto. I've rested long enough. I understand that, Rhaella, I do, he said, kneeling down at her side and taking her hand in his own. But you will help no one by pushing yourself too far. For a long moment, the Queen Mother of the Targaryen dynasty regarded the young man who had saved her life so many years before. Finally, she gave him a soft smile. I know, Naruto, I'll be careful, I promise. His grin lit up the room, and he stood and clapped his hands together. Good, now let's get you dressed. Can't have you meeting your children in nothing but a nightgown, after all. She rolled her eyes, but smiled nonetheless. Yes, that would be a terrible shame. For the next few minutes, Naruto trailed back and forth from the room with a display of clothes and dresses of all sorts, which Rhaella all rejected. Where did you even get all of these? She asked, baffled, even as she waved off another one. Trade, mostly, he replied absently, hanging one up and trying to pick another from the large closet where dresses hung from the railing. A few were special works I commissioned, though that was mostly a cover. I wanted to learn how the master tailors did it. Raising an eyebrow at that, Rhaella was about to ask him why he would do such a thing, when something caught her eye. What about that one? She asked, pointing. Naruto paused in his search and spotted the one she was looking at, and gently removed it. This is one of mine, actually, he said, holding it up so she could see. Rhaella's breath hitched. It was a sleeveless, modestly cut, flared gown that left the back and shoulders covered and ran down to the floor. The hem was a subdued shade of lavender, that slowly lightened as it trailed up into a bright silver at the neckline. The stitching was fine and even, and patterns of lace decorated the entirety of the dress, particularly at the bodice, making it shimmer in the sunlight. That one, she breathed. I want that one. Are you sure? Naruto asked, turning it this way and that. I wasn't sure about this. I'm still not an expert at making clothes. She goggled at him. Are you mad? This is beautiful. You could make a fortune if you make clothes that look even half as good. How did you even? Meh, he said, waving a hand. Benefits of clones. I've had hundreds of them going around the country for years, learning anything that strikes their fancy. A few decided to pick up tailoring on a lark. And since I learn everything that they do. She digested that for a few seconds, still staring at the dress. Well, take it from someone who's spent her life among the latest fashions. This is master-level work, at the very least. He still looked doubtful. If you say so you're sure, you want this one? Yes, okay, here, let me help you with this. He helped her stand and they both walked over to the end of the closet, where a screen stood to afford her a bit of privacy. Despite knowing that Naruto had likely seen her in the nude many times during the 15 years he'd been keeping her alive, Rhaella appreciated the gesture. Painstakingly and with great care, she finally managed to wrestle her way into the gown, and still felt more tired than she was comfortable with. It was only a dress. Naruto, can you help me? Yeah, he said as he stepped around the screen, very plainly looking up at the ceiling. She rolled her eyes. Don't get excited. I just need you to help me lace up the back. He stepped forward again, gingerly looking her way as if she would snap at him for the insolence. She leaned against a convenient rail and shivered as she felt his hands tug on the laces. Are you okay? She replied softly. He slowly tied the back of the dress, not tight enough to make it hard to breathe, but enough to keep it snug. It only felt like moments before he finally let his hands slip. Done. Good, Rhaella responded, turning around. By the time she did so, her legs finally lost the battle and gave out beneath her. Before she could even begin to fall, she was enveloped by two strong arms. Told you not to push yourself, Naruto chided, gently picking her up, just as he'd done to her daughter only a little while ago. Done, judge me, she mumbled into his chest, eyelids drooping. Okay, sleepy, nap time for you, he said amusedly, walking back to her room. We'll survive without you for a few hours, then you can meet your kids when you're not so exhausted. She yawned. Gently, he set her down among the fluffy pillows and pulled the sheets up, noting the way her breathing had lengthened. The dress had several seals stitched into the fabric, so he wasn't worried about it being messed up. Taking a few minutes to make sure she was comfortable, Naruto was about to step out, when he paused. Then, slowly, he came back and knelt by her side again. Tears trailed from her beneath her eyelids, even as she gripped the covers tightly in her hands. Gently, he wiped away her tears with his thumb. Rest now, Rhaella. Do not suffer under the burden you bear, he said quietly, making several hand signs. At the end of the sequence, he pressed his palm to her forehead. Slowly, his blue chakra darkened with angry black strands of energy, released from the woman's mind and subsumed by his technique. His one eye opened, staring at the Targaryen matriarch, whose face was softening by the second. Let me carry it for a little while. Finally, after several minutes, he stood and moved away. Taking a deep breath, Naruto closed his eye and rolled his shoulders, feeling unnaturally stiff. Even as he did so, he looked down at her. The woman was perfectly calm, breathing deeply as she slept. See you soon. After all, there are two people who'll be anxious to meet you, he said, stepping out of the room and leaving Rhaella to her rest. It was very bright in the north, Daenerys mused. Surprisingly so, with everything Viserys had told her of the most barbaric of the Seven Kingdoms, she'd been expecting a land of tangled forest under dark skies, engulfed in meters of snow. On the contrary, where they'd landed was surprisingly warm. The beach stretched for a few hundred feet in each direction. It wasn't really a sandy beach, instead littered with thousands of tiny stones, smooth from centuries battered by the waves. The hill above was covered in plants commonly found near the coast, the names of which she didn't remember. Even as she stood there and privately admired the scenery, Viserys was loudly complaining again about his treatment, even while the sailors they were with transferred their possessions from the longboat to the shore. They seemed long-suffering in their manner, used to being ordered around but unused to it being so annoying. She paused, surprised at herself. Where did that come from? Even as the sailors finally finished their task and Viserys walked farther afield to sulk in private, she hesitantly stepped over to the sailor who'd been in charge of ferrying them to solid ground. She muttered, wringing her hands a little before she managed to still them. As the sailor turned to her, she straightened her back. Thank you. He raised an eyebrow, then a smile spread over his craggy face as he tapped his knuckles to his forehead. 'Twas a duty and a pleasure, milady. We hope you enjoy your stay. The admiral's known for his hospitality, after all. She gave a genuine smile. Every sailor on the Windstride referred to Naruto that way, always with respect. It was different than she was used to. You guys are making me blush. Hardly surprised that he had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, Daenerys turned around and saw Naruto standing there, his sharp canines flashing in a grin. Then he lifted, with one hand, a large coin purse that clinked as it moved. They all went wide-eyed. A gift. Give it to Davos once you're back on board, he'll divvy it up fairly, Naruto said, handing it off to the one in charge, who nearly dropped it. The one in charge turned to his crew and handed it off to two of them, who settled it into the middle of the longboat back, surprised at the weight that Naruto had been carrying with one hand. Turning back, the man saluted. My thanks, milord. No problem, he said, smiling. Who else can I count on to sail around with me on all my crazy adventures? Any time or place and no mistake, Admiral, he responded with pride. The rest of the sailors grinned and saluted as well, before gathering around their boat and pushing off, returning to the ship, leaving the both of them on the beach. After a few seconds, he spoke. Is it so surprising that they're so respectful? Naruto asked, staring after the longboat. She crossed her arms, pulling her cloak tighter around herself. From what I've heard, you've earned their respect. Many times over. He glanced her way, a wry smile on his face. Is it so surprising that they're so respectful to you? She frowned at that, recalling the entire trip, and the way she'd been treated by the sailors. She glanced around for Viserys, but he was nowhere to be found. Your brother is already at our destination, he said gently. I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to say what you really think. She turned her head away and crossed her arms, affronted. I don't know what you're talking about. His smile got wider. If you say so, I should warn you though, that you won't be able to dodge about like that once we reach our destination. She turned right back and glared up at him. You said we would be safe. And I meant it, he said, holding up his hands in surrender. Then he grinned again. But I don't think even I will be able to save your brother from a smacked bottom. Her eyes widened at the idea Viserys was the rightful heir to the Seven Kingdoms. Who in their right mind would even think of doing such a thing? More than that, who would even have the nerve to try? As if seeing her thoughts, the man laughed merrily, and held out a hand for her to take. Come now, princess, there are a few people who are going to be very pleased to meet you. For a moment she hesitated. Then, she reached out and put her hand in his, privately marveling at how warm his skin seemed to be. Then, without a sound, they faded from sight, leaving only the gentle lap of waves against the shore. XXXXXXX. In the central building of Naruto City, meanwhile, two ladies were waiting somewhat anxiously. Ashara silently mused at what this meeting would be like, whilst Elia was trying not to panic. Suffice to say, neither of them were used to having guests. It had been more than 15 years since either had even been in public, at least in places where strangers might recognize them. The occasional trip to visit their respective families in Dorne was really the only time they met other people, excepting the visits to Essos with Naruto, who was happy to ferry them to Anfram to take in the sights. Now, though, they were about to meet two members of the dynasty that had cost both them and the country so much. It was nerve-wracking. A clone of their lover sat nearby in an armchair, reading. He was one of the studious ones. Naruto had explained long ago about what his clones were like. Since he'd gotten so much more powerful, his clones now seemed to contain fragments of his personality, along with fragments of his power. Some they'd met were more prone to reading, like this one. Others went through the gauntlet of emotions, constantly laughing, pranking, plotting, sulking or training. There was also the occasional one who seemed to carry all of Naruto's more perverted side. Well, Ashara mused even as Elia flittered about, fretting about making the room presentable, those ones could still be enjoyable on occasion. Rolling her eyes at her friend, who was bending over to straighten the cushions for the third time, the violet-eyed woman walked over and gave her ass a good, meaty smack. Straightening with a yelp, Elia looked back at her friend in betrayal, rubbing where the hand had landed, even as Naruto looked up, blushing. What was that for? Ashara raised an eyebrow and gave her a flat look. You are becoming hysterical over nothing. Calm down, it's not nothing, she said, eyes wide. This is the prince and princess of the Seven Kingdoms coming to visit, and I haven't hosted any sort of event for more than a decade. Not to mention that this place hasn't been properly cleaned since it was made. Doesn't need to be, the clone interjected, turning a page. The seals the boss put in prevent any infestation of animals or insects, and keep the surfaces clear of dust and mold. There, see, Ashara muttered, you need to relax, Elia. There's no need to get worked up. The woman bit her lip and crossed her arms, still looking unsure. Ashara gave a mental sigh, perked up a bit as she decided what to do. All right, plan B, she thought, stepping forward and wrapping her friend in a hug. After a long moment, the tension began to leave Elia's frame, and she gently returned the gesture, eyes closing in contentment. They promptly flew open again in shock as Ashara began to nibble on her neck. Shara, she gasped, trying to pull away. This is not the time. The woman held firm, though, a single hand trailing down the princess's back, sending tingles up her spine. I told you, she said, her lips trailing up to Elia's throat, nipping possessively. You need to relax. The olive-skinned woman shuddered in her friend's arms, her struggles weakening by the second. But this isn't helping, she mewed plaintively. The clone simply sat there, jaw hanging open, while a trickle of blood ran from his nose. The book sat in his lap, discarded without a second thought. The door opened as another Naruto stepped through, the original this time. He took one look at the two inside. Ashara, stop molesting your princess. You're needed in the main hall, our guests are nearly here. Jerking back, red-faced and panting, Elia tried to calm her rapidly beating heart. Ashara looked entirely relaxed, save for her heavier breathing and the hint of pink in her cheeks. With narrowed eyes, she turned to glare at him. We were just getting to the good part. So I see, he said ruefully, chucking a book at his clone's head, making it burst into smoke. Don't worry, we can continue this later. I'm sure Elia won't mind us feeling her up once our guests have gone. The princess of Dorne blushed harder, while Ashara sniffed. Promises, promises. Then, even as he watched, both of them straightened themselves out, their masks firmly back in place. To all the world, they would have seemed to transform into the perfect example of fine courtly ladies. And then, to his surprise, they hooked their arms with his, Elia on his right and Ashara on his left, and all three of them walked out into the main hall. XXXXXXX. Outside, Daenerys followed the man who was leading them. She'd been popped in right next to her brother, who flinched away at the sudden sound. Naruto had motioned for them both to follow, and started walking. Viserys glared after the man, then at her. She wilted into herself. Still, after a minute of walking, she looked back up and began to admire the buildings around them. She'd appeared far inside the walls, so they didn't have as much time to stop and explore as she might have liked, but still took the time to look around. The buildings in this part of the city were 2 stories tall, all seeming to be made in the same manner. Most were wood, though as they got closer to the center of the city, that changed into stone. They began to get taller as well as they walked. The cobblestones beneath their feet were perfectly flat and even, and every house seemed spaced exactly apart. To her surprise, though, there was no smell. Every city she and her brother had stayed at had their own unique smell, and even Viserys hadn't bothered to cover up the legendary stink of King's Landing. Now, though, it seemed as if the only thing she could smell was the occasional rustle of wind bringing hints of the forest from around them. And it certainly hadn't escaped her notice that there was no people anywhere. The only sound they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps. How long until we're there? Viserys whined. Naruto glanced his way, sighed, and pointed ahead. Another minute. That building is where we're going. They glanced at where he was gesturing to. This building was different from the others, both larger and made in a style that was unfamiliar to them. Finally they arrived, and Naruto stepped aside and gestured at the door. They're waiting for you inside. Then, to both of their surprise, he burst into smoke, leaving the two alone. Daenerys stood there in shock for a moment, but composed herself. She had no idea who they would be meeting, and was getting more and more nervous. Slowly, she reached for the door handle. But before she could, another hand wrapped tightly around her wrist. She looked up at Viserys, who had a strange glint in his eye. This may be my chance, sister, he said. Whatever the beast wants, he hasn't killed us yet. Perhaps he's finally realized who the rightful heir to the throne is, and is turning on that pretender. She winced as his grip tightened. The glint in his eye got brighter, as a strange expression appeared on his face. I will not allow you to ruin this for us. You already failed your duty to the Dothraki savage, so if I tell you to get on your knees and take that freak's cock down your throat, you will do it. Understand? A sudden flare of frustration and anger surged in her belly at his coarse words, and she didn't answer. That changed when a hand seized her by the throat and slammed her into the door. Viserys loomed over her, his eyes flashing with fury and madness. Do you understand? You don't want to wake the dragon, do you? Eyes wide from fear and pain, Daenerys looked up at him and managed to nod. Yes, Viserys, she said in a small voice. He growled and released her, throwing the door open and walking inside without a second look. Knowing the consequences if she made him late, she straightened her dress and wiped her eyes, breathing deeply to try and keep herself from crying. Unknown to her, though, three eyes had been watching the whole scene, a handily placed seal near the doorway broadcasting everything the two had said. Naruto, looking down at the girl from the building across the street, felt a swell of rage and pity. Those feelings were only magnified as he turned to look at the woman standing by his side, who had been watching and listening as well. Rhaella had a hand to her mouth, tears falling down her cheeks, even as she looked down at the daughter who didn't know she existed, the one trying to dry her own tears. Oh, gods, she whispered brokenly, falling to her knees. Oh, gods. Without hesitation, Naruto knelt down and wrapped her in a hug, expanding his presence to enfold the Rhaella in an aura of comfort and tranquility. She shuddered in his arms, the foreign feelings trying to soothe her fraught emotional state. I'm so sorry, he said, running his hand through her hair, privately cursing Viserys for putting his mother through this, even unknowingly. The little shit was in for one hell of a wake-up call. Rhaella, he said gently as sobs began to slow. Are you all right? She didn't answer for a long moment, and pulled back from him. All right? She asked bitterly. No, I don't think I am all right. He winced. Probably not the best choice of words. He won't do anything to her. Elia and Ashara would never allow it, and neither would I. As far as I'm concerned, he can go back with that fat bastard Illyrio, or better still to the Dothraki. She looked up at him sharply. You will do no such thing. He stared right back, mouth set in a firm line. I won't do anything without your consent, Rhaella, but I must admit to being very tempted. If I had known that he acted this way, I would have kept a closer eye on them both. She nodded at that. From what he had told her, Naruto had mostly focused on making sure that any assassins from enterprising Westerosi families never made it within 100 leagues of them, and keeping both from starving in the streets with a combination of convenient gifts, lavish bribes and grisly threats. And it seemed as if his work had been rewarded, in the worst possible way. Rhaella turned away to look at the now empty street, gathering her strength and standing up straighter, a frown on her face and fire in her eyes. Naruto winced again. Somehow, he had a feeling that Viserys wasn't going to be happy by the end of this night. And honestly, he could not bring himself to care. No, his thoughts were reserved for the woman beside him, whose heart was breaking at what her children had grown up to be. It's not your fault, he said strongly. And you know it's not. If anything, it's mine. I should have protected them, should have taught them. A hand seized his chin, and turned his head so he was looking into Rhaella's eyes, anger reflected in the violet orbs. Don't you dare. You've done more than any man ever could, or would, without thought of risk or consequences to yourself. I will not allow you to blame yourself for what my son grew up to be. His gaze softened. As her hand fell away, he took it in his own, his single eye shining bright blue. Quote. As long as you agree to return the favor. She let a breath hiss out from between her teeth, feeling a surge of emotion trying to escape, which she managed to wrestle back with the ease of long practice. Quote. I promise. With some difficulty, Rhaella struggled to her feet, his hands steadying her the whole way. Finally managing to stand on her own, she looked up at him, ready to face the world again. Naruto smiled. Then let's go meet everyone. I imagine they'll all be surprised to see you. What do you mean? She asked, surprised. Don't Elia and Ashara already know? His face assumed the look of a rabbit who'd just encountered a direwolf. No, she gaped at him. What do you mean, no? I woke up a month ago. Why in the world didn't you tell them that I was awake? Quote. I wanted to enjoy the surprise. You, she sputtered, trying to think about all the ways he was an idiot for doing something like that. She dropped her head into her hand and sighed. We'll discuss this later, he nodded, knowing a good idea when he heard one, and they both moved for the door. There would be time enough to get chewed out once this knockdown, drag-out meeting was over and done with. Daenerys trailed silently after her brother, eyes firmly fixed upon the floor, trying to quell the tears of anger and humiliation that so desperately wanted to escape. Her brother walked a few steps ahead, his chin higher than normal as he glared down his nose at everything and anything, not even bothering to see if his little sister was following. The entrance hall they were walking down was longer than she'd expected, and yet somewhat empty. No great tapestries or works of art meant to show off the owner's wealth adorned the walls. But despite being surrounded by bleak, dark gray stone, she couldn't help but be surprised at the feeling of warmth and comfort that seemed to envelop her as she walked, soothing her fear and heartache. Viserys, on the other hand, seemed to be getting more and more tense as they went further in. After only another minute, they finally came to a second set of doors, which Viserys threw open without a second's pause. At this, Daenerys finally looked up. A wide, open hall stretched out before them, brightly lit by floating balls of fire that bounced up and down cheerfully. But it was the three people who stood at the far end that really caught her attention. Naruto was the first she took note of among them. He was dressed much the same way as she'd first seen him, black sandals, a dark shirt and pants with orange highlights, and the red, fiery coat he seemed so fond of. To his left was a woman in an embroidered lilac dress. Her skin was pale and smooth, dark hair flashing in the light from the floating fires. Dark violet eyes, a similar shade as their own. Looked amusedly at Viserys, then flicked her way. To his right was another woman, in a dress that seemed to shimmer between various shades of orange. Dark-haired, her olive skin and dark brown eyes were a stark contrast to her friend. She smiled warmly at Daenerys, ignoring her brother utterly. The silver-haired girl blushed at the attention. They were both so beautiful. Be welcome and find safety and shelter within my walls, Viserys and Daenerys of House Targaryen, Naruto said formally, his voice echoing in the brightly lit hall. Surprised for a moment at such a ceremonious greeting after weeks spent seeing the man laughing and joking with common sailors, they were both caught somewhat flat-footed. They hadn't trained as a prince and princess for nothing, though, and recovered easily enough. Viserys gave a small incline of his head, as befitting the rightful heir of the Seven Kingdoms. No need to bow like a common lord or nobleman. Daenerys, on the other hand, gave a deep curtsy. Her brother had beaten the need for proper manners into her, even when greeting those who he saw as lesser than they, which seemed to include everyone on the planet. And, of course, he never felt as though he should follow his own advice. Naruto noted the difference in their greetings and seemed torn between smiling and frowning, but shook his head. All right, all this formal talk is making me cranky. The olive-skinned woman gave a long-suffering sigh, cutting in with a soft, soothing voice. Naruto, you can't simply ignore the customs of this country because you find them personally unpleasant. Says who? He scoffed. There's plenty of things in this country that are stupid and I'll ignore them as I damn well please. The other woman broke in with a roll of her eyes. And as we keep telling you, if you ever want to be taken seriously as a nobleman, you'll have to learn some proper manners. Coming from you, that's rich, he snarked. Besides, as I keep telling everyone, I'm not a nobleman. I don't even pretend to be. I'm one. The dark-eyed woman frowned at him reprovingly. You are lord and master of this city, despite what anyone says. Considering your plans for this place, you need to learn the proper way the Westerosi do this or you'll hardly ever get any respect. And you will learn, if we have to sit you down and glue a book to your face. Daenerys watched the back and forth with wide eyes. She'd grown up in fear of this man, with her brother constantly telling her that he, among all the others who had rebelled against their father, was easily the most dangerous. To see him being ordered around like this was surreal. It made him seem more human. A warm feeling spread in her chest at the thought. The dark-eyed woman walked forward as Naruto bickered with the other, until she was standing in front of the younger woman. "You must be Daenerys," she said warmly. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Ah, thank you," she responded. She wasn't used to being addressed so informally, or in such a tone, for that matter. And she certainly wasn't used to being talked to while her brother was ignored. The warm feeling began to spread. Viserys wasn't used to ignored either. He didn't like it. "Excuse me," he said thinly, glaring at the woman, then at Naruto. "You have kept me in the dark for weeks. I demand to know why you brought us here." And just like that, the good mood was gone. Both women turned to stare at the young man. The looks on their faces could only be described as disdainful. "Oh, he demands, does he?" the violet-eyed woman said, a dark smile on her lips. "Isn't that cute?" The dark-eyed woman simply glared. Viserys was taken aback by the sudden surge of anger directed his way, and stumbled for a moment. Naruto smiled and laid a hand on their arms. Daenerys watched as both women almost visibly relaxed at his touch. Staring at the younger man, Naruto simply sighed, looking at both of them. "Perhaps it might be best if you introduced yourselves." "Best for who?" the pale-skinned woman asked, but drew herself up nonetheless, giving a small curtsy. "I am Ashara of House Dane, Lady of Starfall." Both Targaryens rocked back in shock. House Dane was one they'd heard many stories about as children. Daenerys asked a question before she could think to stop herself. "Did you know Sir Arthur Dane, the Knight of the Kingsguard?" Viserys had told her all about their older brother Rhaegar's best friend. A legendary warrior and knight, famed for his chivalry and martial prowess, killed by Eddard Stark at the foot of the Tower of Joy at the end of the rebellion. "Know him," Ashara said, her face softening at the childlike wonder in the girl's voice, even as memories flickered through her mind. "He was my older brother." Viserys took that information in, though somewhat angry at his sister for her outburst. He was more interested in what the violet-eyed woman spoke of. He remembered her as a former lady-in-waiting to his older brother's wife, though he hadn't interacted with them while he'd been staying the Red Keep. Surely, as her older brother had been a friend and ally of his own, that meant that she would give her support to him. House Dane didn't speak for all of Dorne, but it wasn't a small house by any means. A smile began to grow on his face, and he bowed slightly in Ashara's direction, eyes raking over her form. "Indeed, I look forward to meeting later to discuss a few things." He didn't notice how Naruto's expression tightened at his presumption, though Daenerys surely did. The other woman stepped forward, glaring at the boy. "Despite what you might think, we are not here to discuss anything with the likes of you, least of all that rapist you call brother," she growled, eyes flashing with anger. Both Targaryens gaped at her for a moment, before Viserys swelled in rage. "How dare you? My brother was unjustly accused by those traitorous bastards and seduced by that northern harlot. I will not let you insult him." "Seduced?" the woman scoffed. "I knew Rhaegar better than you ever did, you pompous brat. I knew what kind of man he was." Naruto trailed a hand down her back, soothing her with his touch, while Ashara simply looked concerned. Gritting his teeth, Viserys snarled at the woman. "And just who do you think you are?" She gave a small, bitter smile. "I'm surprised you don't remember, Viserys. Though you were occupied with listening to your insane father pour his filth in your ear, so maybe I shouldn't be." Closing her eyes and taking a deep breath, the woman drew herself up, staring down at them both. "My name is Elia, of House Martell, Lady and Princess of Sunspear," she said, an undercurrent of steel in her voice. "Former wife and consort to Rhaegar Targaryen." Daenerys goggled at the woman with an open mouth. She'd heard that name before. Viserys seemed to delight in telling stories about her, about the pathetic Dornish princess their brother had been forced to marry. A weak, frail woman, who couldn't keep the Silver Prince happy, forcing him to find another. The tall, beautiful woman staring down at them imperiously seemed anything but weak. Naruto, on the other hand, was torn between being concerned and being proud. Elia had never enjoyed being reminded about how her life used to be. It had never been her choice to marry Rhaegar, but she had done her duty and even grown to care about him. Despite what Robert Baratheon liked to preach, he hadn't been a soulless monster by any means. But as her husband grew older and more distant, she couldn't deny that every fault she'd first noticed about him began to be magnified. Which had soon led to his ultimate betrayal, of both her and their children, leaving them surrounded by monsters on all sides. But she also wasn't the same person she used to be. Squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin, Elia drew herself up, rising above the fear and pain that tried so desperately to drag her back down. Then she turned her head to look at Naruto, who had a small smile on his face. "Maybe now you'd like to tell us why you brought these two here." Before he could answer, Daenerys interrupted. "You mean it wasn't you?" she blurted out. Viserys gave her a withering glare, but she ignored it. But, if you didn't want us here, then why are we? It's not that I didn't want you here, sweetheart, Elia said, glaring at her brother in turn. I am simply unsure that our other guest is worth the effort. Ashara stepped around the blonde, taking up position on Elia's other side, taking her hand supportively. But still, that's a good question. Perhaps you'll like to answer it, Naruto. With everyone in the room looking at him for answers, the man simply gave an enigmatic smile. And what makes you think it was my idea to bring you two here? Rapidly growing tired of his dodging about, Viserys snarled at the man, then whose idea was it? Then, to their surprise, the answer came from a different direction and from a different voice, one that seemed to catch at all their memories. It was mine. As one, they all turned towards the source of the voice. From a side hallway, another clone of Naruto walked in, but it was who walked beside him that had their attention. Elia and Ashara both gasped in recognition. Even after 15 years, they still remembered this woman. She was thin, moving slowly and with great care, as if every step she took actually hurt. Long silver hair trailed past her shoulders down to her back, while sparkling purple eyes took in all of their expressions with a single look. Naruto's clone, after making sure that she could stand on her own, dispelled with a single hand sign. The real one, feeling the familiar surge of memories, took a moment to review them. Upon doing so, he turned to glare at Viserys, who seemed even paler than usual. Rhaella noticed the same, and for just a moment, she wanted to rush over and hold her son in her arms. Then she remembered just what her son had become and ruthlessly crushed that impulse. "Hello, Viserys," she said softly. "You, Moth." He stuttered, seeming dazed and confused. Then, to everyone's surprise, he pitched over backwards in a dead faint. For a few seconds, they simply stared at his fallen body, wondering what to do. "Okay," Naruto said, his estimation of Viserys going down a notch. "Wasn't expecting that." Elia, meanwhile, stepped forward hesitantly. "Rhaella, is that you?" she asked, looking at the familiar face of her mother-in-law. The older woman looked her way and gave a soft smile. "It's good to see you again, dear. You seem happier than last I saw you." Ashara stepped forward with her princess to face the Targaryen matriarch, an odd look on her face. "Without meaning to be insulting, Your Highness, so do you." Rhaella had never disdained speaking to her, despite that she was a mere lady-in-waiting. The woman's smile became slightly more brittle. "I thought I might. Surprising that 15 years in a coma would be more healthy for me than being married to a madman," she said, but managed a genuine grin. Or maybe not so surprising. The two younger women both laughed at that, still in a state of shock over this revelation. Then, Rhaella turned to the youngest person in the room. Slowly, she walked forward until she was only a step away, and lifted her hands, gently cupping the girl's cheeks. "You're even more beautiful than I thought you'd be," she smiled softly. Daenerys looked up at the woman, who seemed so warm and caring and familiar. She and Viserys were the last of the Targaryens. Why did this woman possess the same eyes and hair? Who are you?" she asked, simultaneously hoping for and afraid of the answer. Rhaella felt her heart break a little at that, but managed to keep the tears at bay. "Well, you know my name, even if you don't remember that I belong to it," she said with a small smile. "My name is Rhaella. My husband's name was Aerys. My sons' names were Rhaegar and Viserys. And my daughter's name is Daenerys." The young girl's eyes widened as she stared up into those purple eyes, finally realizing why they looked so familiar. They were the same eyes she saw every time she looked in a mirror. Rhaella gave a genuine, happy smile, even as tears trailed down her cheeks. "I'm your mother, sweetling," she said. "And I've waited a long time to see you again." For a long moment, she tried to think of something to say. Mother," she whispered hesitantly. "Why you're my mother." Rhaella nodded once. I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you all those years." I understand if you're angry with me." Daenerys rushed forward and nearly bowled her over, squeezing the older woman in a desperate hug, which Rhaella soon returned, fresh tears spilling from her eyes. They stayed that way for a long moment, getting used to the feeling. "I imagine there is a lot you two want to talk about," Naruto said softly, a fond smile on his face at the sight. A clone popped into existence beside him. "He can lead you to somewhere private, if you want. I'll also have one take Viserys to his room." Rhaella, still stroking her daughter's hair, gave him a smile. "I think that may be a good idea, thank you, Naruto." Then, to their surprise, Daenerys finally extricated herself from the hug she'd been sharing and turned away from her mother, who let her go, confused. To their surprise, she darted forward and embraced Naruto, who seemed surprised at being clung to by the teenage girl. He quickly realized that she was trying to say something. Thank you, she managed, trembling, even as tears soaked into his jacket. Thank you so much. He hugged the trembling girl close, a small smile on his face. Number problem, kiddo. Dany let go after another second, discreetly trying to wipe her eyes. She quickly walked back to her mother, who held out a hand for her to take, which she did without hesitation, almost as if Rhaella would vanish if she didn't. With the clone letting, the two exited the hall to talk in private, leaving Elia, Ashara, Naruto and the prone form of Viserys behind. Another clone popped into existence and, without hesitation, grabbed the boy on the floor by the front of his shirt and began dragging him away, leaving the three to stand in silence for a long moment. So, Ashara said, breaking the silence. She looked Naruto's way with narrowed eyes. Is this gonna become a theme with you? Rescuing all the pretty damsels in the land? He shrugged, still smiling. Who knows, maybe I'm just lucky. Some luck, Elia murmured, still staring in the direction mother-in-law had went. She said she was in a coma for 15 years. How did you even find her? A few of my clones infiltrated Dragonstone during the last days of the war, he replied. I wasn't really capable of rational thought at the time, so they took it upon themselves to see if they couldn't find a way to end the war sooner rather than later. Rhaegar and Aerys were dead by then. Robert was savoring his victory. He paused, a brief look of anger crossing his face. While Ned was no use to anyone, focused only on finding his sister. Both of them tensed slightly as he talked about the past. They remembered those days all too well. Naruto rubbed the bridge of his nose. My clones arrived just after the birth, when the storm was at its height. They found the two kids being spirited away by Willem Derry and a few servants to Bravos, I suspect with the aid of Varys. The spider, Ashara asked, surprised at that. Why would he do that? A card he could fall back on if needs be, he said, furrowing his brow. Varys was smart enough to foresee that Robert's reign would most likely be unstable. Keeping the Targaryens alive and out of the way would give him a reliable second option, just in case. I imagine, with how Joffrey has turned out, that card may be needed now, more than ever. Then, to both of their surprise, he suddenly laughed. But of course, seeing as how they have mysteriously vanished, I imagine he's shitting bricks right about now. The two promptly shuddered at that image. They had nothing against eunuchs in general, but Varys, in the brief time they'd known him when he had been in the Mad King's service, had always seemed too slippery. Anyway, we arrived when most of the castle was in the process of being deserted, he said, stumbling over how exactly to describe what was, essentially, himself. Most of the nobles had gone by then or been lost with the royal fleet. Most of the servants were quietly pilfering whatever wasn't nailed down. He walked over and took both their hands, before a quick teleportation had them appear back in their shared bedroom. Elia and Ashara, used to his random relocations by now, simply stumbled a bit as the floor changed beneath their feet. That's when I found her. Rhaella. Elia asked softly. He hummed in assent. Ashara simply stared him in the eye. What happened, Naruto? She said she was in a coma for 15 years. As to what happened, I found her in a room at the top of the centermost tower, the stone drum, I think it's called. She wasn't in good shape. At that, a stormy expression began to grow on his face as he stared out the window. The effort of birthing Daenerys had weakened her greatly, but that was simply the last straw. What Aerys did to her, he growled, his hands tightening into fists. What he did to her was an open secret at court, Ashara said, feeling the familiar surge of protective rage that gripped her every time the Mad King had finished burning someone, knowing exactly what he would do next, and being powerless to stop him. An unseen force began to press against the walls of the room as Naruto began to shake with fury. If Jaime Lannister hadn't gotten there first, I would have ripped the bastard to shreds with my bare hands. In the next second, both women had embraced him from behind, their presence draining the rage from him with practiced ease. All three stayed that way for a few minutes, waiting for Naruto to relax enough to continue, which he soon did. What happened to Rhaella could only be described as torture, he said under his breath, just loud enough for them to hear. The birth was simply too much. Her body began to shut down under the strain. The servants had already left with her children by the time I got there, I imagine because they thought she was already dead and it wasn't worth the effort. Except she wasn't, Ashara guessed, leaning into him. She might as well have been, he snorted. She was barely conscious, bleeding internally, with old wounds and scar tissue on nearly every inch of her body. Not only that, her bones were weak from malnourishment and showed signs of being repeatedly broken. Both of them gasped and clung to him harder, feeling sick at the thought of what he was describing. They'd known on some level what Aerys was fond of doing, but to hear it described in such detail was horrifying. He took a deep, rattling breath as he struggled to continue. She was on the verge of death by the time they got there. Healing her internal wounds was only the first step. I learned from one of my friends that the human body can survive up to 20 minutes without a heartbeat and still be resuscitated, though at that point the mind is almost guaranteed to be completely gone. Elia moved around to his front, still embracing him while she struggled to keep her tears at bay. Ashara wrapped her arms around both of her lovers, trying to comfort both even as her own eyes misted. Rhaella's heart stopped for 6, Naruto said, remembering with perfect clarity his clone's struggle to keep the woman alive. But her will was strong and she refused to give up. It was a stroke of pure luck that she managed to survive. Both women clung to him harder at that, and Ashara tilted her head up to look him in the eye. It was a stroke of luck that you were there to save her. He managed a soft smile at that, and leaned down to give her a quick kiss, which she happily returned. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, he said when they separated, holding them close. Even though Rhaella survived, she was close to death for a long time after. Her body could only take so much of my healing chakra at once, and I could only stop for so long before she began to relapse. It was a delicate balance, which I had to continually reinforce. And then, once she was out of danger, there was still the coma to consider. How could I tell you that she was still alive, if it was still possible that she might still die, or never even wake up? It would have been unthinkably cruel. Maybe, Elia mumbled, and somehow I don't think we'll be in this particular situation again. But I'm asking you, right here, right now, never to leave us in the dark like this again. We want to know, we deserve to know, even if you think it's something that may hurt us, or bring us false hope. She slowly retreated from their embrace until she was standing right in front of him, lifting her chin and straightening her stance. Then she spoke, with a tone as clear as crystal. We have chosen to spend our lives with you, Naruto Uzumaki. We share your confidence and stand at your side. We have chosen to put our trust in you, because you have proven yourself worthy of it. We will fight for you if needs be, in peace or in war. All we ask is that you trust us in return. Naruto stared long and hard at Elia, hair messed up, clothes askew, makeup running, her eyes red and puffy. She'd never looked so beautiful. He stepped forward, gently taking hold of her hands. I promise, now and forever, she smiled, stood on her toes and brought her lips to his. They embraced for a long moment, and finally separated, enjoying the look in each other's eyes. And together, they turned to look at Ashara, who was standing beside them, a genuine smile on her face. What she said, Naruto grinned at that, and pulled her into their shared embrace, giving her a kiss in turn, enjoying the closeness he shared with these two amazing, beautiful women. Gradually, they moved over from the window to a couch, which he promptly plonked down upon, pulling them both down with him. They stayed like that for a while, simply enjoying being in each other's presence. Naruto snaked a hand across the back of the couch to play with a strand of Elia's hair, while his other trailed down Ashara's back, making them both nuzzle into his chest in contentment. Why do you do it? The violet-eyed woman suddenly asked, making the other two perk up at her sudden question. Do what? Why do you work so hard at everything? She questioned, turning her head to look up into his single eye. From the moment you arrived here, you have near single-handedly changed the future of this country. There is technology here we barely dreamed of, knowledge and wealth that belong to a few that you've spread to so many. And the number of people you've saved grows by the day. But I have to wonder why. This world doesn't owe you anything. For a few minutes, he simply sat there, a faraway look in his eye. What a question. Perhaps not, he finally conceded. But maybe I decided I owe something to this world. Maybe I did something in my homeland that I bitterly regret, something that cannot be forgiven. Maybe every person I help and every life I save is a way to try to make things right. Both women had straightened as he talked, looking at him in concern. Naruto did not like talking about his past, something he'd made clear early on in their shared relationship, and they both respected that. To hear him speak in such a tone, filled with such pain and self-loathing, made them want to hug him. So they did. Naruto swelled the chakra in his belly, and both women shivered in delight as a wave of warm, caring energy gently caressed them, making their hurts and pain from the events of the day fall away. They were still there, but had been made near inconsequential. Ashara rubbed her cheek against his chest. I love when you do that. Makes me feel all tingly inside. Elia opened her eyes and frowned, resting her head against Naruto's shoulder. Don't be vulgar, Shara. What do you mean, vulgar? She asked, opening her eyes to glare back at her friend. You feel the exact same way. Don't deny it. I never said I didn't, Elia sniffed. I simply have the propriety not to say so out loud. Ashara reached over and yanked on her nipples. Kya, your current state would suggest otherwise, she said, preening. Elia, who let out a hiss at the rough treatment, turned her head to glare up at Naruto, who was smiling at them in amusement. Aren't you going to defend me? Struggling not to chuckle, he finally nodded. As you wish. Ashara quickly became wary as their blonde lover glanced her way, a predatory grin on his face. But before she could think to react, he pressed a single finger into the base of her spine, and injected a surge of chakra into the nerve cluster there. GKH. A single, strangled moan hissed from between her clenched teeth as her hands clenched the fabric of his shirt, her legs squeezing together at the sudden surge of pure pleasure that roared through her body. Elia watched with wide eyes as her best friend squirmed around on the couch, clinging to Naruto, her eyes blank. She discreetly rubbed her thighs together. The ninja, staring down at the unresponsive woman, tapped a finger to his chin. Seems it's a bit too effective. Ashara gurgled unintelligibly. Elia enjoyed the sight for another second, then glared up at him. Oh, that's just not fair. It's all fair in battle and bedchamber, he chuckled, raising an eyebrow her way. And I'm missing one eye, but the other can still see plenty. Don't try to pretend you don't enjoy this. She glanced in a different direction, a blush lighting up her dusky features. I don't know what you're talking about. The man hummed in consideration, slowly trailing a single finger along her arm. It wasn't even a remotely sexual gesture, and yet she shivered all the same. I think you need to learn how to conceal your toys better. Those were meant to be hidden, she hissed, heating up at his casual mention of what she and Ashara often spent their alone time with. Shoved under the couch does not count as hidden, he said, trying not to snicker. While the Dornish may be considered somewhat edgy compared to the rest of this world, what I used to get up to in my old one would make you spontaneously combust from the sheer eroticism. Whatever you may think, you are still woefully lacking in your knowledge of the many different arts of love. Swelling indignantly at the blow to her Dornish pride, she was about to loudly assert the opposite, when a hand came up and tweaked at her nipple again. Damn it, Shara, she shrieked as she cupped her boob and glared furiously at her soon-to-be former friend, who had finally recovered from Naruto's technique and was giving her a small smirk. The amethyst-eyed woman held up a hand, proclaiming peace. Then she glanced up at Naruto. What you said, is it true? Are we truly lacking in such skills? He inclined his head. She murmured, thinking deeply. Well then, it's lucky we have such a willing and able teacher. Slowly, she reached over, taking Elia by the chin, and drew her into a deep kiss that lasted for quite a while. When they finally separated, both were breathing more deeply. They both turned their heads his way, lascivious looks in their eyes. Won't you teach us? He was quiet for a moment, desire darkening his gaze, until he gave them a lusty grin. Well, I never said you didn't have potential. Damn, here we go again. Ned glanced back at his blonde friend. What's the matter? Naruto glared at the horizon, where a city was slowly coming into view, gleaming in the midday sun. Extremely developed senses were par for the course for even an average ninja, and he was hardly average. He could see the auburn towers of the Red Keep and the tall arches of the Great Sept of Baelor in great detail, even from miles away. His problem at the moment wasn't sight, however. Oh no, his problem was smell. It's gotten worse, he coughed, pinching his nose shut. He had no idea how it was possible. The last time he'd been in the city was only a few years ago, and even then it had smelled disgusting. Now, though, it had somehow gotten even worse. Hell no, he growled. I ain't living even remotely close to you, stink. Either you go, or I do. What are you mumbling about? Ned asked. Several guards were looking at the ninja oddly. I'm trying to come up with a plan to get rid of that stench without either burning the city to the ground or making the tide sweep it away. Naruto. Ned chided. How many times do I have to tell you? No unleashing demonic powers on the poor, defenseless city. Naruto blew him a raspberry. Oh, very mature. Sansa tried not to snicker and Arya dissolved into giggles as the horses plodded on down the King's Road. They were getting close to King's Landing, as evidenced by Naruto's revulsion to the stink. Blah, I don't know how I'm gonna stand it. Well, you'll have to, Arya piped up, you still have to teach me to fight. Yeah, Naruto said, throwing his arms up in a magnificent stretch. I have a few plans in the making for your training, little wolf. Pouting at the nickname, she reached into her saddlebags and threw a piece of bread at Naruto's head. Her pout increased when he simply caught the small amount of food and began to chew on it with a grin. To be honest, he was actually pleased to be in the south. He enjoyed the sun on his skin and the smell of trees and fresh-tilled farmland after so long in the snowy north. The trip had lasted another month because of various delays, especially the wheelhouse the king's family stayed in. His mood dropped a little as he remembered the last time that had happened, chewing thoughtfully. XXXXXXX. Oh, come on. His yell followed on the heels of the sound of splintering wood, as the axle underneath the back wheels of the carriage gave way for the third time that day. The king cursed as well and called a halt to the entire procession. By the time the immense bunch of nobles and guardsmen had slowed to a stop, Naruto had shimmied underneath the wheelhouse, making his legs stick out as he took a look at the damage. Ned stood near, leaning over to see what was going on. Naruto, if you would just let the artisans underneath. Those idiots have been trying to fix this thing for weeks now. I keep telling them, they put too much gold on the rear end of the carriage, the axle is too thin to support that much weight. Whoever decided to make the thing out of maple should be fired this instant, that wood's too brittle for something like this. The older man rolled his eyes. This complaint was one he'd become intimately familiar with over the course of their journey. The ninja griped constantly over the ineptitude of the artisans who designed the thing, to the exasperation of anyone who listened. Have you fixed the bloody wheel yet, boy? Robert asked, his wife and 2 Kingsguard trailing behind him. It's not the wheel that's the problem, moron, Naruto griped back. As I keep saying, this thing is carrying too much damn weight. Cersei heard him and tried not to blush in embarrassment. It had been her idea to bring the thing all the way north, to make sure her children were protected from the elements. Unfortunately, with the sudden malfunctions that the wheelhouse constantly suffered from, Tommen and Rhaella had grown to hate the thing and spent nearly every waking moment outside, managing to talk Robert into letting them learn how to ride horses. Her only daughter even managed to use her cuteness to wheedle piggyback rides from Naruto, which he provided with long-suffering smiles. Indeed, Joffrey was the only one who spent his time in there, shutting the curtains and turning it into his own private area, refusing to speak to anyone. His silence had become unnerving. Even now, when such a malfunction would have normally sent him rushing outside, cursing at anyone in earshot, there was only silence from inside the carriage. Can you fix it? We're all waiting out here. Robert's shout snapped her out of her thoughts. I agree, Ned said, nodding. Even I'm getting tired of this thing. Work your magic, Naruto, we'd like to get moving. For the 20th damn time, I don't use magic. Ignorant pricks. Bah, who cares what you use, Robert said, waving a hand. Do whatever needs doing, boy, I'm getting impatient. Oh ho, impatient, are you? He growled, crawling fully underneath the carriage. Fine. They lost sight of him for a few moments, even as 2 groups of clones appeared on both sides of the carriage. The ones on the far end promptly grabbed at the front wheels, holding them in place. And a second later, they all found out why. The wheeled structure began to tremble. Those farther afield, who had already begun to take notice of their argument, stopped what they were doing and stared, whispering frantically to friends and colleagues. They watched, noble and common alike, as slowly, the carriage began to shift. Naruto, both eyes closed with exertion, bracing his back and both hands against the bottom of the colossal wheeled structure, pushed. The back wheels lifted clear off the ground. Everyone watched with open mouths and wide eyes, even as his clones began to set the axle back into its proper alignment, hands aglow with green chakra, the splintered ends of the wood meeting and fusing into a single whole, strengthened by his wood release. Finally, Naruto hopped out from beneath the carriage, letting it fall back to the ground with a single deafening crash. Dusting off his hands, he looked around at everyone who was goggling at him with open mouths, and glared at them all with a gimlet eye. What are you all standing around for? Let's get moving, XXXXXXX. Anyway, he said, swallowing the morsel. I have a few things I need to do, so I'll see you all later. Like what? Ned asked suspiciously. Things. Don't even. And without further ado, he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Naruto. Ned roared after him. Damn that boy, why does he always have to leave right when I need him? XXXXXXX. Miles away, on a solitary rooftop, Naruto groaned in pain. Oh, that's so nasty. In a flash, he'd appeared on top of one of the tallest buildings in the city, right above the Street of Steel, where most of the city's blacksmiths practiced their craft. It was just as well that he hadn't done so in Flea Bottom, otherwise he may have actually passed out. A mountain dropping on his head couldn't knock him out. It smelled like the worst stench he'd ever smelled, somehow mixed with a bunch of other terrible ones specifically to smell even worse. With the amount of chakra that naturally circulated through his body, his senses had all been elevated to superhuman levels. His sense of smell alone rivaled an Inuzuka's, and he couldn't even fix it, because as far as his body was concerned, it wasn't broken. Pinching his nose shut and blinking away the moisture in his eye, his attention was drawn to the sound of a woman's scream. "Oh, there's so much I'm gonna have to do here to get this place back into shape," he muttered, breathing through his mouth and flexing his fingers. "Might as well start with that. XXXXXXX. I still don't see why I have to be here." "You're here because they asked for you, hun," Ashara said, a small frown on her face. "And we didn't think to refuse. They are your family after all." Rhaenys snorted and crossed her arms. "No one decides that for me but me, Auntie. They're no family of mine until I say they are." Elia and Naruto exchanged looks. That sort of talk was exactly what they were worried about. Ever since the two Targaryen children had been brought here, Naruto had thought that things had been going well. Rhaella and Daenerys had spent near every waking moment together, speaking at length on every subject they could think of, laughing, eating and occasionally crying, but doing so with each other. He'd never seen either look so happy. Rhaella had come alive, in more ways than one. Every second she spent in her daughter's presence, all the years of pain and torment that still haunted her all seemed to fall away, leaving a woman who could simply enjoy being around people who cared about her. Daenerys simply glowed, really, truly happy for the first time in years. Viserys, however, was still locked in his room. Rhaella had shown next to no desire to even look at him, and there was no one that lived there that would even think of forcing the issue. Except for her younger son, but Elia and Ashara had gotten enough of a measure of him to scoff at the idea. His shrieks of rage had interrupted more than one tender moment before Naruto finally put a sound-dampening seal on his room, for which everyone was grateful. That was a confrontation that no one was looking forward to, but then, nearly a week ago, Elia had suggested that her own daughter come meet her grandmother and aunt. The two Targaryens were shocked, which rapidly turned into delight at the prospect of yet another family member, though Naruto and Ashara were being slightly more circumspect. Rhaenys may have been quite grown up in a lot of ways, but the one place that her reason failed was whenever anyone brought up her father or grandfather. Dorne was still replacing most of the tableware from the last time that had happened. But Naruto and Ashara had been outvoted, hence why they, Elia and Rhaenys, were standing in a room near the entrance to the dining hall, the youngest having been brought there by Naruto from Dorne only an hour ago. "Are you ready?" he asked, one hand on the doorknob. Rhaenys looked askance at him, and asked in turn, "Are they?" He winced. "Good point." With a twist of a wrist, he opened the door, letting them all through into the chamber beyond. Rhaella and Daenerys were waiting near the opposite end of the room, standing close together as if for support, while floating balls of fire lit the room with a pleasant orange glow. Even from a few meters away, he could see the tension in their stances. Maester Aemon at Castle Black may have been a Targaryen, but he wasn't in their immediate family, not the same way that Rhaenys was. He'd been a maester for longer than most of them had been alive, and though Elia and Ashara had met him several times over the years, always in secret, Rhaenys had always refused. Rhaella and Daenerys were more closely related perhaps, but that was hardly a guarantee of a good meeting. Aerys and Rhaegar were closely related to Rhaenys too, after all. With some apprehension, the group approached the pair, nervousness filling the room from more than one occupant. Rhaenys stopped a few feet away, expressionless, and cast an amethyst eye over her aunt and grandmother. Seeing that she was making no move to speak, the elder of the pair took a hesitant step forward. "Hello, Rhaenys. I doubt you'd remember me, but I remember," she murmured, stepping closer. "I may have been a stupid, stubborn kid at the time, but I remember those years in the Red Keep, the moments spent with Mom and Auntie, when you'd come visit to lift our spirits." Elia and Ashara both felt a surge of emotion as they remembered that time, when they tried to find a few moments of happiness when everything around them seemed so harsh and dangerous. "I remember seeing you after my grandfather had spent a day with his flames, and with you," she growled, her dark look and shining purple eyes making her look truly formidable in the flickering light. "Even then, even when I had only the faintest idea of what kind of monster he actually was, I still remember wanting to kill him." Rhaella began to shake, memories and the fury of her granddaughter making her start to breathe more erratically. "When did this girl get so tall?" Then Rhaenys stepped forward, gently taking the older woman's hands in hers, a soft smile lighting up her features, stilling the anxiety as soon as it could form. "And I remember you being there, always ready with a soft smile or gentle word, when even holding me was causing you pain. So I suppose I only have one question." Without any hesitation, she enfolded the silver-haired woman in a gentle hug. "Do you mind if I call you Grandma?" With a choked sob, Rhaella returned the embrace. That would make me very happy." Withdrawing with the gentleness she only exhibited with members of her family, Rhaenys held her grandmother's hands in her own and turned to look at Daenerys, who stared back with wide eyes. You must be Daenerys, she murmured, quirking a half-smile at the younger girl. I hope we can be friends, even if you're technically my aunt. The silver-haired girl beamed and nodded happily, thrilled at having a new family member. They stood there for a long few moments, while Ashara, Elia and Naruto looked on, the two women holding hands, Ashara grinning proudly as Elia gave a watery smile. Naruto snorted once and ran a hand through his hair, grinning ruefully at a prank well played. Making us worry like that. Little scamp. Rhaenys turned her head his way and gave him a grin of her own. Worth it to see the expression on your face, Blondie. They both began snickering, making Ashara roll her eyes and Elia shake her head, still smiling. Shall we adjourn to another room with more comfortable seating arrangements? Naruto asked, to which they all agreed, only to pause as he suddenly stiffened. On second thought, maybe we should head outside. They all looked at him oddly. Why? Daenerys asked. He favored her with a strained smile and ran a hand through his hair. Seems your brother got tired of being locked in his room and broke down the door. He's coming this way, and seems somewhat upset. Far in the north, looking down from the top of the greatest feat of engineering the world had ever seen, Jon Snow tried not to brood. For as long as he'd known what the circumstances of his birth meant for his future, he'd wondered if there would ever be a way to regain his honor. Honor lost due to circumstances beyond his control, from before he'd even been born. Which didn't mean he wasn't fully aware of how lucky he was, how hellish his life could otherwise have been if he hadn't grown up as Ned Stark's son. He'd grown up fed, clothed, and warm, when all too often bastards might be left out in the cold, both figuratively and sometimes literally. His father, brothers and sisters all loved him, even Sansa, though that had almost seemed to be in question when she had been younger. Until someone stepped in. Jon sighed quietly, remembering the event that had changed Sansa's outlook, and may have altered the path of his life. The day when Septa Mordain had made the mistake of pontificating about the circumstances of his birth within Naruto's earshot, and Lady Catelyn made the even bigger mistake of trying to defend the woman's point of view. The blonde boy, only a few years older than he and Robb at that point, had angrily defended Jon, dismantling every argument that the pair had presented and not even pretending to compromise on his point of view. So Jon's a bastard, who the hell cares? How is that his fault? He didn't choose to be born that way. You're blaming him for the circumstances of his birth, not to mention the sins of people who died before he even existed. How the hell is that fair? The entire affair had dragged on for so long, drawing quite a crowd in the meanwhile, that the entire Stark family had managed to gather, including a rather flustered Eddard Stark. Jon quirked a half-smile as he remembered his father's expression, caught looking between the combatants, before half-heartedly deciding to support his wife. A decision he regretted almost immediately when Naruto's ire switched to a new target, and verbally lambasted him for a solid 5-minute period about the importance of family, the stupidity of his wife's point of view, and for even thinking that what she was doing was okay. By the end, everyone in the courtyard had the rather singular experience of watching the Lord Paramount of the North turtle up in embarrassment. The argument had continued from there with Naruto switching right back to his original target, and only ended when he actually threatened, to make Lady Catelyn's life a living hell if she even thought about doing any further harm to the young boy, emotional or otherwise. Even now, his last words still made Jon smile. You wanna know why I have such a problem with how you treat him? Because he doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve your scorn. Motherless, honorless, who cares? He's a good kid, better than I ever was at his age. Hell, it's not that he doesn't deserve you, you don't deserve him. Quirking a smile, Jon mused at how everything the older boy did changed the way people saw and did things, often through sheer force of will. It was a character trait that everyone in the Stark family admired, though it often made his father lament at ever having encountered him. Now, standing atop the wall with his direwolf sitting silent beside him, far from everything he'd grown up knowing, Jon wished he had a little of that same fortitude. Naruto's ultimatum had ensured that Lady Catelyn did not do anything to him openly, but no one could miss the chilled stares and tight-lipped silences whenever the two of them even entered the same room. No one with eyes could miss it. He knew, intellectually, that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone, but the desire to do so remained, always at the back of his mind, holding him more firmly than one of Arya's hugs. The desire to make something of himself, to atone for the sin of his existence. So he stood here, where Starks of ages past had guarded the border of the North since time immemorial, part of a sacred order that had stood their watch for more than 8,000 years. He dreamed of being counted among their number, of becoming a man of the Night's Watch. And, not so surprisingly, Naruto had been one of the few who tried to warn him against it, to tell him what the ancient order had become. How those same Starks who'd built this place would weep if they could see the state of it. Criminals from every corner of the 7 kingdoms, all funneled here, many thousands of them spread across a dozen castles all along the wall, held together only by the deft hand of the older members and the many clones of Naruto who patrolled the place. And the person those new recruits hated the most, the one responsible for bringing their crimes to light, who had single-handedly rebuilt near every castle along the wall, was the one who Jon admired more than anyone in Westeros. The only one to give him an option, besides joining the Night's Watch. Now, he breathed, filling his lungs with icy, biting air. Decisions. XXXXXXX. Damn it, Naruto said, scowling at nothing in particular. Having that walking windbag interrupting a moment of reunion was exactly what he didn't want to happen. Daenerys and Rhaella deserved more than 5 minutes to get to know their newly discovered family member. Or, at the very least, didn't need to have to deal with the pretentious little prick who was family in nothing but name. Elia and Ashara were scowling, remembering the last time they'd been forced to deal with visories, and not looking forward to repeating the experience. Rhaella had quietly stepped forward to hug Daenerys, as much giving the young girl comfort as she was seeking comfort herself. It hadn't escaped anyone's notice that Daenerys had shivered the moment Naruto had said Visory's name. Rhaenys remained expressionless, save for a slight narrowing of her vivid violet eyes. What's the plan? She finally asked. Folding his arms with a sigh, Naruto glanced at the wooden door, knowing that the pathetic little lizard was only a few minutes from barging in. It's not my decision, nor should it be as far as I'm concerned. The only person who gets to decide what to do with him are Rhaella and Dany. Daenerys stilled for a moment as she glanced at her mother with soulful eyes, wondering what she would say. I barely know him, Naruto. The last time I saw him he was barely 8 years old. Squeezing her daughter a little tighter, she shut her eyes firmly and tried to steady herself. I don't think he's worth your time, Grandma, Rhaenys said, gently, but firmly. Visories reminded her far too much of her grandfather for her to ever consider accepting him as any family of hers. He sold off his sister like livestock for the mere promise of an army. I say return him there, see if he can get an army through his own merits. Rhaella stilled, gazing with not a small amount of sadness at her granddaughter and holding on to Daenerys for dear life, whose eyes were misty. Elia stepped forward, putting a hand on her daughter's arm. Rhaenys, there are many things in this country I may find ridiculous, but that is not one of them. There are few things more accursed than a kinslayer, and given what Naruto did to bring Dany back, that would mean death. Turning towards her mother with the slightest hardening of her eyes, the purple-eyed young woman stood tall. There are worse things in life than death, Mom. I would slit my own wrists before I'd endure a life of slavery, and you don't see him acting very contrite about inflicting that fate on his own sister. He's all the worst parts of our family legacy, rolled into one irritating package. We're better off without him. He wasn't always like that, Daenerys murmured, her own memory filled with the craggy smile of Sir Willem Darry, and of a house with a red door. And Aerys wasn't always the Mad King, Rhaenys softly replied. No one spoke up for a while after that, thoughts too consumed with the past to do otherwise. After a long silence, Naruto stood tall again and held up a hand sign, popping a clone into place beside him, who turned and marched off down a hallway. Ashara, the only one who could really speak at the moment, glanced at him questioningly. What was that for? He sighed. Whatever you all decide, I don't think anyone is in a position to decide it now. My clone put Vizzy back in his room. He ran a hand through his hair. I doubt this will get any easier if we put it off, but I don't know what else to do. Drying her eyes, Rhaella finally managed to rally, staring at the ground hard. I won't give up on him. Not yet. We'll be here for you, no matter what you decide, he said, everyone nodding in support, even Rhaenys after a moment. The older woman gently took her daughter's hand. I think we will retire for now, and see you all again on the morn. Sleep well, Grandma, Rhaenys murmured. You'll need it. Rhaella stared at her for a long moment, then gave her a soft smile. As long as I have my family, all can endure anything. With that, the pair walked out, their footsteps eventually fading into silence. Relieved at seeing that there was no ill feelings between her daughter and mother-in-law, Elia breathed a sigh of relief and snuggled under Naruto's arm, which he surrendered without any fuss, both enjoying the closeness. Then the young man stiffened for a moment, an odd cross between a smile and grimace on his face as memories from a shadow clone hit him. What happened? Ashara asked, noticing his expression. Oh, not much, he replied, running a hand through his hair. Seems my clone managed to drag Robert to a small council meeting, and he figured out how busy I've been. The violet-eyed woman snorted. I bet the Fat King wasn't too pleased with the work you've been doing in that stinking shit pile of a city. Not all of it, sure, but he's holding out some hope for the other projects I've got in the works. Stretching lithely for a long moment, Ashara stepped closer and snuggled under his other arm, closing her eyes. Not our concern, indeed it is not. Naruto was of the firm opinion that how much or how little his ladies concerned themselves with the outside world was entirely up to them. He was also under no illusion about what would happen if they ever decided to get involved. The country would experience a shake-up, for sure. As he was musing on the idea, the last lady in the room was thinking quite a few less polite thoughts. A small huff drew Ashara's attention, making her open a single eye to regard Rhaenys. The younger woman was standing a few paces away, silken dress shimmering with hues of black and orange, arms crossed, giving the two ladies under Naruto's arms a heated glance, before she turned her head aside, lower lip jutting out quite prominently. Spying an opportunity for mischief, the lady of House Dane grinned. Jealous, Ray, the younger girl sniffed dismissively. Jealous, me, don't be ridiculous. Now you know what Naruto says about repressing. Like he can judge, he represses more than a silent sister. Watch it, girly, he growled. You watch it, jackass. Now, Elia broke in, trying not to smile at the image of Naruto draped in religious garb. A baron would laugh himself silly. Let's not end today with ill temper. Ashara and I were thinking of going back to the snuggle room, care to join us? I wish you wouldn't call it that, Naruto groaned, looking pained, even as Rhaenys perked up. You know, mother, I would love to join you in the snuggle room, she replied. Then, she gave a girlish giggle, one that raised the hairs on the back of Naruto's neck. Delighting in his wary expression, she slithered between him and her mother to hop on his back, arms locked around his neck, nuzzling him like a cat. Hurry, Naruto, she breathed into his ear. The bedroom awaits. Suddenly very aware of every contour of the younger girl's body molded against his back, he cleared his throat, and their surroundings changed. Stop that, Elia said, trying to be stern, and failing, as her cheeks grew hot. Stop, what? The younger girl asked, squeezing the older boy close and giving her mother a smirk. Naruto was having exactly none of this, and turned around to fall backwards onto the plush bed, making the younger girl shriek with laughter. Okay. Get off me, you blonde lummox. Rolling off the squirming girl and setting his hand on his cheek, Naruto smirked down at her. You're 10 years too young to play games with me, girl. Popping up, Rhaenys gave him some side-eye and a smirk of her own. Is that a challenge? He flicked her in the forehead. No, now go to sleep. Flinging himself off the bed, he curled around the older ladies again, and after a moment they were gone. Rhaenys sat back on her palms. After a moment, a small smirk appeared on her face. See you soon, Naruto.